Yes, chores are a pain. But really, my troubles began in 1534, with the birth of Nobunaga Oda. Nobunaga's Ambition is a series of strategy simulation computer games for almost every console ever built. If you count each release as a single human year, Nobunaga's Ambition is almost old enough to drink. Its actual age is old enough to be suffering a midlife crisis, which, based on longtime fan reactions to most of the newest games, seems to be the case. To the untrained eye, the games might look like they're about geography. In truth, Nobunaga's Ambition is more like a parasitic brainworm. The series is broadly set in the Sengoku period of feudal Japan, commonly referred to as the Warring States period, where various regional warlords held large swaths of land and battled for territorial dominance. The basic goal of any version of any individual game is the total unification of Japan. Absolute control. I don't know if I'm an absolute control kind of person. Actually, I'm almost certain I'm not cut out for this. Forget unifying Japan. To survive at all, the player has to lie, invest in agriculture, roleplay as middle management, make important decisions, snuff out threats to their own safety ahead of time, honor agreements. In more modern entries, you'll also witness famous named historical events and even participate sometimes. These are incredibly good reasons someone under 30 would refuse to play. Don't make my mistake. Nobunaga's Ambition is highly deceptive. It doesn't look like anything worth talking about. It looks like how a textbook might if some dumpy, tweed-clad professor type tried converting said textbook into a video game. During the development of this video, and whenever someone in my personal life asked, "So, what game are you doing next?" I was struck with the realization that the appeal of some games is impossible to properly convey in a few short sentences. I'd been there in the past, but never found myself actively draining a person's life force with the subsequent explanation. I can only say the games are foundationally about people, about time, about dreams. Of all the juicy bits worth picking from the bone, I'm particularly interested by Koei's commitment to feeding the exact same history, same country, same people, same time, into wildly different mechanical molds. Almost every game is functionally different to play, so no one recollection of a Nobunaga's Ambition campaign can explain the appeal of the series. A history told through play, 15 times over, and then some. Of course, it wasn't always about all of Japan. Kawanakajima no Kassen is one of the oldest Japanese computer games focused on historical Japanese warfare. It might actually be the oldest. I just don't make enough money to pay a Japanese-speaking producer to go and check. And when I say old, I mean dinosaur old. I mean at least basically as old as the history it simulated. It was coded on an MZ80C, this thing, a home microcomputer, back in 1981, by a young man who'd taken up the challenge of saving his father's dye and chemical wholesaler business. The game was originally created for any number of Japanese home computers as a fun way to justify owning a home computer, by series founder and eventual CEO of Koei, Yoichi Arakawa, known professionally as Ko Shibusawa, who just wanted a cooler name, I guess. Kawanakajima no Kassen, per the creator's own words, was not created with success or sales in mind, but for the, quote, delight of playing an enjoyable game. It sold 10,000 copies by mail order, so we thought, maybe we do another one. The establishing series title, 1983's Nobunaga no Yabo, only focused on the Chubu region, central Japan. It's also at least 99% impossible to convince someone to play today. When it suddenly took off, Arakawa set to work porting the game several times to various Japanese home computers, and in a few short years, he released a Mahjong game, a different simulation game about the rise of Genghis Khan. And finally, in 1986, Nobunaga's Ambition, the sequel to the original PC-88 game, this time expanded to include all of Japan. It also received multiple console ports over the next few years. The Japanese word yabo comes prepackaged with a relatively negative connotation, something the English word ambition isn't as obviously saddled with. Ambition is one of the core concepts tied to black mana in Magic the Gathering, the magic that kills people. But at least in the States, we use ambition to imply drive, purpose, vision, all relatively good qualities that don't quite match the designs and treachery subtly implied by yabo. Later games come with affixed subtitles to round things out, but I especially appreciate the way ambition works as a positive term in English. Nobunaga Oda's portrayal is core to the identity of the games, and while he's initially presented in the raw historical context, and soon after as a menacing figure, he rapidly evolves into something like a visionary, the herald of a new age, which matches the ambition descriptor perfectly. While he was a ruthless warlord, so were most of his contemporaries. They used to boil people back then. It wasn't noble at all. The word ambition leaves it squarely in the player's hands to not only write their own version of events, maybe coming to understand the mercurial nature of history along the way, but also to enact their own ambition and understand the implications of it. Nobunaga's Ambition never reached anything resembling popularity with American audiences. While the games reviewed well, with one reviewer claiming they were glued to their seat for the 13 hours they played the game, they were, regardless, pushed firmly into the corner as weird games for people who enjoy complex strategy, explicitly for the people who fixate a little too much, maybe even an uncomfortable amount, on the history of empire, the kind of people who come up with Hatzadolf Mittler, for example. Normally I'd play every game in a series before reviewing them, but this video is more of an exploration of the series' capacity to tell emotional, emergent stories, and most of these games were never translated officially or by fans. A wide selection of Nobunaga's Ambition entries require at least some level of Japanese to play, and factoring in the systemic complexity inherent to any entry, they're not particularly playable without a basic grasp. I can handle a simplistic RPG. This stuff, I don't know about that. The box art suggests a more mature kind of experience, far removed from the cartoonish company mascots and the whimsy of yesteryear, and it is. But there's Lord of Darkness's English box art stamped with the text, "Introducing a new kind of troublemaker." Guys, you just called him the Lord of Darkness. We're not trying to keep him from egging houses. We're trying to kill this man. Most of the collected box arts consist of dignified or menacing portraits of the eponymous warlord, and in a classically Koei style, grasping at painterly realism, until the later generations where they become smoother, younger, even more sympathetic. At its most fantastical, most aspirational, most abstract, Nobunaga's Ambition is romanticized history. And as a child who grew up on Pokemon and Digimon and Yu-Gi-Oh! And other assorted collector shonen material, I really wanted to swing a sword at somebody. Instead of fiddling with menus, that and looking at older men was not particularly high on my list of priorities at the time. I mean, I got over it, but I'd played other Koei series in the past, but mostly avoided their strategy games, Romance of the Three Kingdoms included.
Feel the power of my magic!
As a person who minored in history during school and with a general interest in Japanese video games, whose only adult vacation was a trip to Japan after teaching in Korea for a year, nothing about the presentation sold me on the potential slog of a 30 to 50 hour strategy simulation. Another version of me less tolerant of menus, thinking, and plain aesthetics would have picked up Kessen instead, another Koei series that also aims to simulate the Sengoku period of Japanese history, at least for 2 of its entries. But it also felt wrong to pick up an alternate, maybe better version of Nobunaga's ambition, at least to some subset of people, one explicitly created to explore the cinematic possibilities of the very same time Koei was already fixated on. No. Simply for the sake of playing a more obviously prestige video game. Still, I struggled to break in. My main interest in Koei games came from its other divisions, Team Ninja and Omega Force. Team Ninja wasn't originally a branch of Koei, it was one of Tecmo's development divisions before the companies merged in 2009. Omega Force was originally a Koei division founded back in 1996, and it handled the larger body of Musou games, mainly Dynasty Warriors. Both of these divisions focused on action, instant gratification, and that was most of what I expected from the company's work. Since the first time I saw the character designs of samurai warriors, their peacock flamboyance and their mythical moves, Nobunaga's ambition carved out a space in the back of my mind. These characters came from somewhere. Sengoku period Japanese history, namely, but they existed in another game from the same parent company. They were playable in maybe more pure forms. It's worth noting that the Warring States period is deeply ingrained in Japanese cultural memory, persistently informing even modern works. Artists twisting recognizable historical figures, tearing them from their dusty word prisons and molding them in bizarre new forms is hardly uncommon. Samurai Warriors builds on what Dynasty Warriors did to Chinese history by picking up on a facet of any famous warlord's personality and maximizing it for symbolic and even comedic effect. A player doesn't need to know that Hisahide Matsunaga had maybe kind of a bad reputation. Oh my god, that sickle sword, that haircut, that tongue. Well, harumph, I say, Nobunaga's ambition would never be so unsubtle. Okay, so, did you know that one of Nobunaga's retainers and eventually one of Japan's three great unifiers, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, was at one time referred to by his Lord Nobunaga as Kozaru, meaning little monkey? And so samurai warriors turned him into a relatively short man in golden armor to represent potential or status. He wields a staff in battle. He looks strikingly similar to video game depictions of Sun Wukong, the character from Chinese myth in feudal Japan. He acts like a monkey. Yeah, you're not getting off the hook here, Neo. At least the headgear is based on something real. This man also crucified Christians, climbed the ladder to status before making it impossible, via legislation, for others to do the same. Well, he was known for his monkey business. Yeah! Nobunaga himself is often romanticized as a malevolent demon king owing to his historical ruthlessness, but that reputation and his preserved suit of black armor went on to influence modern portrayals of the man, transforming him from whoever he actually was into a cruel and cunning villain.
I've just transferred my power into this golden evil statue.
And a young woman. And a little girl. And cats, I guess? Nobunaga, am I right, fella? You'd think Nobunaga's ambition would have done better in the West. Many a young Western gamer was introduced to Nobunaga Oda as Devil King, the renamed for a Western audience version of Nobunaga featured in Sengoku Basara, or to the Western player, Devil Kings. Sengoku Basara was considered so Japanese by its localizers, so unparsable and repulsive to the target demographic that they changed the characters' names to invoke animals, images instead. Red Minotaur, Hornet, Frost. Imagine if Viz Media, terrified of distraught American children being unable to understand the mere existence of another culture, unironically called Ichigo Strawberry. Carrot Top. Sengoku Basara, just as a point of comparison, is much looser in its portrayals of famous Japanese warlords than even samurai warriors. If you're one of the main characters, you're probably safe. But you're definitely getting a makeover. Tadakatsu Kando is a Gundam. And there's really nothing I can add to that. I'm interested in capturing and studying the person who portrayed the infamous confidant and eventual traitor to Nobunaga, Mitsuhide Akechi, in this way. Subtlety is not a part of this conversation, not even a citizen of this country. They made him the Double Grim Reaper. And if you were even slightly less spoken of in historical records and hoping for some kind of charitable representation, well, this is Soren Otomo. He defended his lands from encroaching Mori and Shimazu forces through turbulent times and extended influence over 7 regions. Here he is in Sengoku Basara.
それでは一緒に Let's Happy Ceremony!
This kind of historical fictionalizing is alluring, taking a real person and warping them beyond recognition. I wanted to see where these characters originated. One day, I thought, one day, I'll play Nobunaga's ambition. And that day came, pretty quickly, because being disgustingly obsessed with Pokemon at the time, I learned through a fan site that Tecmo Koei was developing a crossover game, Pokemon Conquest, featuring characters from Japanese history, again, but to be clear, these are samurai warriors designs, battling for control of Japan, with Pokemon. So that was a day one purchase. This is kind of a channel landmark because it's the first time I've featured a Pokemon game in any real capacity, despite being an enormous Pokemon dork for so long. Not so much anymore, though. I'm really jazzed that it's Pokemon Conquest that got the spotlight first, to be honest. Pokemon Conquest is one of the most bizarre and robust Pokemon spin-offs ever produced. I struggle to imagine the kind of person demented enough to pitch this concept. You know, feudal Japan wasn't really a fun time. Probably the last thing anyone would think about. I mean, reading through these brutal human struggles for power and supremacy would be cute collectible monsters. But when you break Pokemon down and compare it to Nobunaga's ambition, they share some broad similarities. Both ask the player to rely on the power of others. Both ask the player to conquer, become notable or worthy in universe through battle. Because in both cases, you want to be the very best there ever was. Both have an excess of character, even if it's not immediately apparent, and both are ultimately about collecting them all. All this said, Pokemon Conquest is a terrible primer for Nobunaga's ambition. Even at its greatest TRPG aspirations, the core games are functionally grand strategy, and don't often feature this kind of unit deployment, these tiles and directions. Even in the oldest games, the most TRPG-adjacent combat, powering up individual units is not the bulk of the game. I'd say less than half of your time playing any of the main series games involves combat. It's an appropriately simplistic system, but entirely removed from the main lineage. It casts off the traits that define Nobunaga's ambition. While you're directed to play through multiple scenarios, Pokemon Conquest wants the player to approach from a completionist standpoint. Collect all the warlords, evolve all the Pokemon, complete every scenario, which all runs counter to the ethos of any number of these other games. You are not expected to complete every scenario in any given game. You are definitely not expected to recruit every enemy officer or ever devote attention to them. You can kill them if you want. You are absolutely not expected to play as every clan. Depending on the game, any set scenario has anywhere between 17 and 50 possible clans to choose from, making the possibilities so expansive that Nobunaga's ambition demands some amount of liquidity regarding any kind of intended experience. It's a much more player-directed game, a simulator, which is something Pokemon Conquest is not. That said, it was my introduction to Nobunaga's ambition. It's what I knew first. What I wanted, though, was very different. Trawling through forums to find the best Nobunaga's ambition game for a beginner, I came across a thread that was succinctly answered with the newest one, or Sphere of Influence on Steam. But the answer was immediately followed by a question. That's cool, but I'm looking for a political game. Can I have my enemies assassinated in Nobunaga's ambition? At first, I curiously read on because the question sounded about right. I wanted a political game. I wanted to assassinate my enemies. It's only now, having played a modest handful of the games and having unified Japan at least twice, that I find this question almost depressing. In my defense of my previous self, that is, the version of me that had not yet begun their journey through the series, what pulsed at the heart of that question was fear. I knew the basic premise of the game, but I couldn't imagine actually carrying it out. Strong-arming every other clan into compliance sounded impossible. It also sounded too robotic, too repetitious. Surely a series with 40 years of development had assassinations. Surely 200 years of historical political turmoil would feature assassins. Because looking at the map, looking at the presentation, the series looks boring. Painfully dry. It looks like a board game nobody ever picks, so it rots on the shelf. It looks as exciting as that textbook you kept, but never read again. It doesn't look like a video game. Looking like a video game was the great strength of Samurai Warriors and Sengoku Basara, and part of why Dynasty Warriors, which is younger than most of Koei's strategy series, has in 2025 shipped more than double Nobunaga's Ambition's 40-year total. One of the key lessons I picked up regarding video games as a medium came to me around 3 years ago, playing through Tui again, in digging for meaning in something that appeared visually chaotic, maybe unrefined to some degree, diametrically opposed to so much quote-unquote great Western art. Surely in terms of aesthetic, I realized that video games as a young medium were effectively aesthetic playgrounds for the many developers bringing their established tastes and skill sets to any given studio. The medium is a hotbed for vision without constraint, or was historically. This is most clearly illustrated by Daniel Dochu, the art director for Guild Wars, who mentioned in an interview that his own mishmash aesthetic, born from worldly inspirations of all kinds and sampling from all cultures, could be considered fresh and interesting in the video game medium specifically, fully aware that if it were brought to an architectural design school or other such institution, university classes, etc., he would be, quote, laughed out of the room for being too cliché, too derivative, too illogical. There's room to try new things in video games, especially because any artifact of this medium, any game, acts as a confluence of multiple kinds of art. By the same token, games succeed with visual signifiers. God of War is mythological. It's not playing at realism. Kratos isn't thinking, boy, I better hit this guy a normal number of times, so he needs a suitably mythical weapon to rip through the mythological action. They gave him blades attached to chains, physically burned into his flesh, to signify his fate as Ares' sworn soldier. So now the relatively muted palettes are lit up by the very weapon controlled by the player's inputs, tearing through the screen space, demanding attention, making your position crystal clear. It looks like a video game. It looks inviting, and it tells a story before ever arriving at player input. This is also why certain critics are wrong about FF10's Seymour. In a world of hair that could be fixed to the end of sticks and turned deadly, trotted out onto the battlefield in Nobunaga's Ambition, Seymour's hair is an abomination. But the artist knows this. That's the misunderstanding. The question is not, what the hell? Can this guy even draw? The question is, why did they make it like this exactly? And it's not complicated. Seymour is effectively the Sephiroth of FF10, but he's also in a public position of benevolent power, a spiritual leader. The player is supposed to instantly intuit that something is off about Seymour, and Seymour's design is meant to taunt the player. Per his own societal standing, Seymour is the only person who can get away with Seymour's haircut. The storytelling is clear, and again, without ever having to hear a line of dialogue, without ever getting into a fight. Video games do well with visual signifiers, and they can thrive even looking visually bizarre because the medium does not demand strict adherence to established artistic norms. My fear was that Nobunaga's Ambition couldn't be interesting like my other favorite games. With its penchant for historical simulation from a developer who wants to represent Nobunaga as a person instead of a demon king, it seemed like the kind of game that could only ever be boring. And until I saw Nobunaga's Ambition for what it was, I believed that. As a licensed, tax-paying video game super nerd, I'm paid to know that player interactivity, both in the ways the player controls or directs the experience, and the way the game's inner rules create boundaries and define cause and effect, are themselves two sides of the same coin we all call mechanics, and that mechanics tell stories. I just didn't think the voluminous menus and statistics could act as fertile ground for narrative. I was wrong. And Nobunaga's Ambition Awakening, the most modern release as of the writing of this video, is now among my favorite games ever made. But like listening to unfamiliar music, sometimes an experience takes time. Sometimes the music has to reveal itself to you. We're going to look at my earliest attempts to understand Nobunaga's Ambition as a video game, the one that finally opened the door, my first successful campaign, and my final campaign. And I'll see you on the other end, if you ever make it. It's possible I'm only able to tolerate these games because I'm sitting at a robust 33, okay? I'm not a kid anymore. Dreams pared down. Eye twinkle, hanging on by a thread. I've taught high school. Man, I've seen who's replacing me. Initially, I decided to play Nobunaga's Ambition Awakening, the most current series entry as of the writing of this video, even though it looked a little flat, because other competing games shove enormous rendered armies and officer models into your face constantly. There was a kind of mystique, the kind you get from a framed portrait, keeping the focus on your base, your region, centering the player in the world, and lightly directing them towards expansion. I was immediately overwhelmed by the number of selectable scenarios and the number of clans available. In most games, there is no recommended scenario, nor any need to complete them in any given order, or even any need to complete them. A single successful campaign in Nobunaga's Ambition could take anywhere from 30 to 70 hours, depending on the context and the level of difficulty. You were not meant to spend 300 hours completing each scenario once, and this is the first major hurdle. Like any successful warlord, like anyone who ever got anything done, you have to make a choice. And another choice, priming the player to feel comfortable in their decisions. I appreciate the way Nobunaga's Ambition invites the player to consider themselves, to enter that world deliberately. I know people, grown adults, who are palpably afraid of making tough choices, and I earnestly worry about the day those people end up in a situation that demands action. Every part of the game is about action. Every choice in the game is deliberate. You need to be a chooser to be a player. Unfortunately, I really screwed myself on those first choices. I thought to myself, well, I'd really like to be isolated, safe, somewhere far, far away from Nobunaga and the other famous warlords. So I picked a small island off the coast of Western Japan, a place so remote and with such limited opportunities for growth, I would have had to have the game's unique mechanics mastered already to grow at all. And so I fumbled around building stuff until I couldn't build any more stuff. I tried diplomacy, which didn't really go anywhere, and eventually I decided I must be strong enough by now to kick someone's ass. I've been playing for an hour. I sent my meager army off to the nearest enemy, got into a mild brawl, and immediately lost. Not even a chance at success, because I didn't understand how battles worked. And that was the end of my first campaign. There is no shame in learning or in starting over. As I read so perfectly put in a forum post, don't try to complete every campaign you start in Nobunaga's Ambition. You need to get a feel for things, feel the weight of the blade in your hand, or the horse you ride before you can take meaningful action. But I wasn't ready to completely write off my chosen clan. I started over and let the AI play for me, which resulted in almost the exact same outcome, actually. They never went on the offensive, just built up their single castle and let time pass. Was it afraid to attack? Was the clan doomed? Was the math not there? Or was it afraid of taking chances? As I watched the years tick on, I was amazed at how little I was learning. I thought, maybe the AI would execute some strategy I wasn't aware of, or, I don't know, show me how battles work, but it never once created the possibility. This really shouldn't have surprised me. Nobunaga's Ambition is mostly about selecting options from menus. Feeling frustrated, I went all the way back. Same scenario, but this time with a recommended clan, the Ouchi. Look at this smug, land-grabbing shit. While I had more castles to play with, I also had a lot more to manage. And I was really looking forward to scrapping with someone smaller, so I launched my army get into a siege battle and not knowing the mechanics, lost real fast. So that was the end of that one. And I was watching tutorials during this time, but nothing about the game was materializing. They always said, try diplomacy, or focus on your fares, which are gold-producing structures in your home base. But none of this actually changed anything because I didn't understand basic game flow. The last campaign I took a crack at involved the Saito, who also came recommended, and while they were allied with the Oda, they were also poised to sweep down and crush them on a whim. I figured the clan would be easier to manage, with the Oda acting as a buffer between myself and some other major clans, and it was for a long time. I got a little bit better at building structures, using diplomacy, and balancing the budget. And it all fell apart in a blink. Eventually, the Imagawa clan, one of the biggest clans in the region, decided to invade from the east, and lacking for proper battle experience, any notion of defense, even basic commands like calling in support from allies, and no understanding of sieges, I lost an important battle and the enemy dealt me a crushing blow. You gotta understand, I have a 100% success rate for quitting things, and Nobunaga's ambition did not come easy. Most worthwhile things don't. I'd enjoyed the simple, fast-paced action of Warriors games in the past, but they weren't exactly sustainable entertainment. At best, I'd sink 50 solid hours in one, and that was it for the year. I can hardly remember any of the time I spent with those games, even though I liked them. Ease of access does not necessarily translate to a fulfilling experience. Eventually, I got so fed up with trying to learn the game that I decided to let the AI play for me a second time. I wanted to watch what it did so I could determine if it was actually possible to win in Nobunaga's ambition, which I knew was entirely possible, but in that state, believed otherwise. I picked Nobunaga at the height of his power, making sure to quickly expunge Mitsuhide Akechi from my ranks to avoid triggering the Hinoji incident, which would lead to Nobunaga's death and the total fracture of the clan. And within 3 short hours, the game was over. Nobunaga Oda conquered Japan, just like how history seemed destined to unfurl. Nobody rose up to stop him. Nobody could. If only he'd ever lived long enough to try. I didn't get anything from watching the play experience. Like most things, it's a game you have to fumble through, learn by failing. But I did get something from seeing him win. A single changed factor, the expulsion of Mitsuhide Akechi, meant that Nobunaga had no natural predators left in the game. In his time, he was peerless, but he did not live long enough to unify the country, shuffling off before Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Ieyasu Tokugawa clashed for true supremacy. The game is constructed out of approximations of historical fact without any innate limit. Nobunaga was free to run wild in his prime. Maybe any of us could accomplish anything we really wanted to if only we lived long enough to try it, and try often enough. That's basically how having a YouTube channel works. But his flame burned so hot and so bright, it was bound to consume its fuel entirely. I am deathly afraid that in my short time on this earth, I will have only ever lived half a life, hampered by material reality, both monetary and concerning the limitations of my own vessel. And it seems the longer I live, the less likely it is I'll ever accomplish even a fraction of what I have to. And that's before figuring out if I've been good enough or loved enough. What if all of our lives boil down to a single factor, a correctable mistake, a controllable outlier? And if mine does, will I recognize it before it consumes me? So really what I needed was a better starting point. Difficulty is a funny subject. A scroll through any exchange between two players on how the game ought to be played, and almost without fail, one will insinuate that the other just doesn't play as well as them. A difficulty, skill, these concepts are integral to video games. They're part of the language we use to discuss controls and mechanics. People routinely mention in video tutorials for Awakening, the main subject of this video, that extra hard mode isn't really all that hard, which is maybe the most useless phrase I've ever heard spoken about this game. Nobunaga's ambition, as a whole host of games, actively refutes the concept of canon difficulty. Gamers be warned, the information you're about to hear, it may offend. Allowing the AI to play in your stead for the full duration of any campaign means that the developer is more concerned with allowing the player to see the game, more concerned with letting them watch history unfold in their simulator than they are with getting the player to actively participate, whether or not it gives you achievements. This feature is present in even the earliest accessible versions of the game and has been consistently maintained for 40 years. More importantly, difficulty has always been tweakable and often vary drastically. It isn't just easy, normal, hard. There are 5 difficulties in the second game. The first game Chosokabe ever programmed had 10 difficulty levels. Koei wanted people to play at the level they felt comfortable with, and the more modern games expand on these options massively. Nowadays, there are individual sliders for things like enemy income, player income, enemy aggressiveness. You can lower the enemy's testosterone in Nobunaga's ambition. In fact, a lot of extraneous forgiveness is optionally granted to the player. You can choose whether or not characters will die when they historically do. You can decide whether officers can die in battle in certain versions of the game. You can cheat death. You can toggle whether death is a major factor in your game, or at least several of them. Of course, veteran players know very well that easy mode is baked into just about every version of every game, regardless of the difficulty sliders. You can pick the Takeda. You can pick the Hojo or Uesugi or Mori. You can play as Nobunaga Oda, the main character himself, and the game will wipe your ass for it. Yes, clan power varies by game, but in general, certain clans are more privileged than others. They control more land. They have greater access to resources, have fewer immediate threats, even have friends. Nobunaga's ambition is a profoundly player-driven experience, and that's because it isn't chess or a ladder-ranked RTS game, it's a sim. You're meant to enjoy learning a little about Japanese history while occasionally experiencing emergent narrative. This ain't about flagellation. It's video games, man. I feel like I have to repeat this for anyone who didn't fully understand. Nobunaga's ambition does not factor balance into its gameplay. Yes, if something is broken, it'll get patched. Yes, in modern releases, various clans get tweaked so they can shine a little brighter. But the fact is, if you pick the Murakami clan, you're going to get trampled to death by the Takeda unless you pull some real fancy moves. They control more than 5 castles. You have 3. You're pincered between 2 of the strongest forces in Kanto, and despite this person being historically allied with the Uesugi clan, the daimyo does not benefit from a free alliance with them the way some other clans do. He exists to be stomped to death, and no developer is stepping in to wipe his tears away and hand him a cup of cocoa. He gets to die, or work for somebody else. Nobunaga's ambition captures the harsh realities of human life, a world where some people are privileged far more than you will ever be, a world where some people are just better than you at things and calls that fun. To be fair, they didn't call it Nobunaga's encouragement, okay? Nobunaga doesn't show up to say, "You've got this, homie." They definitely didn't call it Nobunaga's sympathy. I would not bet on this man saying things like, "Be kind to yourself. It'll work out. You'll bounce back, buddy." If your puny nobody clan gets targeted by the big regional bully, well, you're dead. And yet, the tools to craft a kinder experience remain. I am convinced that Ko Shibusawa, the series creator, would thank you personally for playing his game regardless of what difficulty you played on. It cannot be stressed enough that having an easier or harder time with your chosen clan will not break the narrative weight and value of that campaign. You can get the full Nobunaga's experience on the easiest difficulty. I figured maybe Awakening was too hard, which is pretty funny in retrospect, but regardless, I set out to try a whole heap of other Nobunaga's Ambition games to see if they could teach me something I was missing, or offer another point of view that actually clicked. I played almost every generation of Nobunaga's Ambition for some time. I even tried playing the oldest and creakiest games, which are a learning experience not unlike studying law. I watched video tutorials. I tried listening to older men explaining the strategy necessary to play the games. Nowadays, you aren't asked to acquire guns or hire X number of ninjas or to place combat units in bizarre, confusing, multi-screen battles. Modern Nobunaga's ambition is sleek enough to appear mechanically dense, and it is. But the earliest games are a nightmare tangle of exacting numerical particulars. They are hard to genuinely recommend. I then thought of learning the PS2 games, Rise to Power and Iron Triangle, which are both sufficiently different. I skipped ahead to these because mostly anything released between them and Lord of Darkness was published exclusively in Japanese. In Rise to Power, the player goes about investing in their clan and taking out others on the road to unification, exactly like you'd expect. But unlike earlier games, it has the prestigious title of First Fully 3D Nobunaga's Ambition game, which is more of a milestone than it sounds. The second PS2 title, Sotenroku, was stuck in Japan, maybe because it still made use of, at the time, outdated sprite art, making it appear more budget, more of a B game, and unlikely to impress anyone but longtime fans, which were witheringly few in the West. You try getting a God of War gaming, Final Fantasy fantasizing, Devil May Cry running, fidelity spoiled punk. Excited for this. The preceding title, Renseiki for the OG Xbox, featured a 2D interface and home base, but also had 3D combat segments, even if they were a little chaotic and experimental. Rise to Power, fittingly named, was the first Western release since 1990's Lord of Darkness and let the player jump between fully rendered castle towns, one for each castle they owned. Let them build a thriving economy out of every castle's unique geography, lending a sense of discovery to the experience. You want more castles, not just for the sake of expansion, but to see what this cropped and crafted version of Japan can offer. Elephants mainly. But its combat is slow, meandering, and absolutely excruciating when you find yourself in a losing position. This is the kind of game you play over an entire summer, alone, because you've got nothing else going on. The sequel, or the subsequent game, as most of them don't meaningfully build off the previous entry and instead shake up the formula entirely, is a bit controversial in the series. Iron Triangle is, I'm gonna say, significantly easier than it looks and more player-friendly than many of the other games. Koei rendered the entirety of Japan in 3D, but shrunk it down massively, abstracting the entirety of the country to a smaller handful of fiefs than seen in other games and simplifying play. That doesn't mean just anyone can jump in, but after watching a tutorial video, I realized that most of the buildings in the game are functionally irrelevant. The player mostly only wants to build the most efficient buildings to generate the most gold, food, and soldiers, with many buildings being far less useful, far too niche, and even outright useless, like the decoys. The player is also capable of abusing the enemy AI or turbocharging their power relative to their opposition by stockpiling muskets and producing riflemen, among other tricks you can look up if you're curious. It's a fun enough game once you learn the core features, even pretty to look at, in that blurry PS2 way, but it was missing something. Something to get excited about, I guess. While these PS2-era games are pretty experimental, they take on some interesting forms and features because of it. In Rise to Power, you can punish or outright execute your own officers. Not that I have any interest in being a tyrant. I remember a fellow substitute teacher who, turns out, also taught in Korea for a time. He was stationed closer to the eastern shore, and I was living closer to the western shore, so we never would have met, but we were there at similar times, and he told me about the stick. He was handed a stick, more of a cane, I guess, and told that if students misbehaved, he was free to discipline them as necessary. He assured me he never did that, and I assured him I never had or even heard of such a disciplinary method while I was there. But Korea is not a monolith. Rural areas are sometimes a little different than cities, and that kind of punishment was rapidly on the decline by our time. I was just happy to commiserate with someone over the shared sense that our lives were so limited, our perspective so small before going overseas. Perspective isn't something as cliche as everything. Perspective is a vessel to pour yourself into. Perspective is an incubator to grow more of yourself. Perspective, I was sure, was necessary to understand Nobunaga's ambition. Of course, none of my fiddling with different clans or AI control or other games actually helped me unravel Awakening. I didn't understand how sieges worked, and I had no tricks or tactics to stop huge invading armies. I was almost ready to call the entire project a wash and move on, cut my losses. What's so frustrating sitting behind a camera, trying to convince people that old, kind of rough video games are worth your time, and arguably more emotionally significant than whatever modern release just dropped, is how ephemeral personal experience is. I can't transmit those feelings to you. I can't make understanding instant, and so I can only ask for trust, which is something I had to do to break in. Reading any comments section of any game's soundtrack will reveal scores of reflective, nostalgic people reminiscing about their fond memories of Nobunaga's ambition. Yeah, the game where you play with menus, because games are capable of evoking so much more than they seem. That and like, if you're in the comments section of your favorite old game soundtrack, probably got some stuff going on. You'd think failing so frequently and so consistently would have put me off. It's just not for me. But I don't trust that instinct anymore, at least not in me. I thought the same about Monster Hunter when it was just a little bit weird. I thought I just couldn't play shooters until I finally tried one on a computer with a mouse. I've had to let a lot of unforgettable experiences reveal themselves to me. A lot of the time it was something small, getting stuck on a mental block, and here stood a game that rejected me, defied me to learn it. The fact that I tried to make the game work by trying so many other versions to demystify it is testament to the utter alienness of the thing. A whole new look at the medium, at least for me. It's the kind of game you get stuck on for a while. So I chose to do something uncharacteristic and searched for advice. I figured all of the responsibility was too much for my current skill set, and my patience was rapidly dwindling, so I needed something even softer. The benefit of a 40-year-old series is eventually they'll put something out that you can at least understand. My real journey with Nobunaga's ambition started with Ascension, a spin-off title to the much more popular Sphere of Influence. And it's the only game that allows you to play not as the daimyo, but as a retainer. What if you were not the most important person in the room? What if your name wasn't on the lips of every scheming politician and dirtbag knife-licking thug in your geographical area? What if you had a home? What if you could earn a promotion? These are the questions answered by this single flickering moment in the series. Nobunaga's Ambition, Sphere of Influence, Ascension, is an alternate release of the core game, Sphere of Influence. Until Awakening, SOI, as they say, was the most modern release with a full English translation. It developed its own legacy and happens to be enjoyed by a pretty diehard following. And yes, I did play Sphere of Influence before trying Ascension. I just kind of got bored. Too often in modern games discussion, a person will submit a game as the greatest, the best of its kind, both in flippant social media posts and Game of the Year lists, and frequently enough that it seems the highest aspiration most people have for games discussion is what the best things are, instead of what any individual game, any unique artifact of the medium, means to them personally. Let's embrace the things we resonate with and search for the language to convey why, and hopefully more specifically than best. Ascension, being a modern Koei PC game, came with various issues and bugs that have, as far as I'm aware, been long since fixed, though it's still a fundamentally different experience built on the bones of another game, possibly not worth the investment, and only really worthwhile for someone to whom the idea of officer play instantly appeals, someone who doesn't want all of that responsibility, at least right away, as someone who would rather spin their wheels for hours tending to a single fief, then plotting against enemy dynasties. This appealed to me as someone who consistently failed to play a proper Nobunaga's Ambition game because it offered a level of intimacy and decreased responsibility that the others couldn't match. Not only would I develop a greater bond to my region, or at least my castle town, but I'd also have the chance to enter a microcosm of the series. Ascension effectively gives players the closest possible view of the world of Nobunaga's Ambition. The fact that I can compare that one PS2 game and this one almost equally probably isn't supporting my narrative. As I mentioned, the other entries can look impersonal with the camera pulled back and a bird's eye view of the action. Most human contact is abstracted, and only in the rarest cases are characters given models, even if they're generic. This is not Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Officers don't duel or debate each other or immediately express any kind of personality outside of text and stats, so it can be a challenge to develop any kind of instant bond with the games. Don't get me wrong here, Nobunaga's Ambition is highly intimate and even capable of fomenting fictional parasocial relationships. There's a reason Ko Shibusawa describes yelling aloud while playing his own game. It's just that it requires the player to actually know what they're doing. Ascension lets you create a custom officer or play an established one. To be clear, that means you can play as, like, Nobunaga's third cousin, though given his historical treatment of his family members, at least his brother, I don't know if I want to do that. I knew I wanted to roleplay in some way. It's the only real series opportunity to explicitly do that, so I chose a clan, the Oda, and then chose a retainer, kind of at random, and found myself embodying the man who was historically assigned to raise the young Nobunaga. That backstory doesn't actually impact play at all. By the way, you aren't expected to, or even able to train Nobunaga in swordsmanship or, like, teach him how to perform a tea ceremony. Instead, the game is designed around a series of targets. While total unification is still the overarching goal, as a retainer, you have a diminished capacity to meet that lofty ambition, so you do things befitting of your status. You're given a plot of land and told to build a town from the ground up. This means erecting resource-generating structures, investing in arts and culture, and trying your best to lay this fine web together in a way that best complements growth. For example, some structures are more productive when built near specific buildings or nearby a particular geography. Markets love foot traffic and rice paddies need rivers. If you build yourself into a corner, no worries. You can just demolish the offending structure and do what you like. Yeah, I said it. Screw you, peasants. You don't like me tearing down your market stall? Well, tough luck, Daisuke. I need 25% more efficiency out of this gold mine, and now, that's your problem. NPCs of all kinds will visit your fief and give you advice, ask you for favors, build friendships, and give the player a window into something more human than the other games provide. You can befriend a retainer from another clan, which will make it easier to convince them to defect to your side. You can maintain a friendship for years, only to find yourself on opposing battlefields someday. Nobunaga's Ambition is actually a pretty funny game. You know, you'll be smack in the middle of managing your economy and waging war, and suddenly
Christianity arrives.
While the top-down versions of the games tend to flatten the human element, leaving the player to fill in the blanks, this game shows us the blasé reality of a world at war, what it means to hole your identity up into a place, and what it means to fight for control of cold, unbreathing soil beneath the weight of thousands of lives in the flux. With your limited reach, you fully realize your place in this space. Nobunaga's Ambition is often comparatively cold. It feels good to be wanted, useful. Every time I've taught, there were kids who gravitated to me. There was a little boy, maybe 6 years old in South Korea, who always smiled and seemed happy whenever I taught his class. I remember all of those kids, but I remember him best because he was one of the few people who seemed like he actually wanted me there. There were a few guys in the high schools I routinely taught at who really didn't seem like they had anyone else to talk to. That was the part of the job I liked the most, feeling like I could make a difference for real people, like make someone's day better, connect. I probably should have gone into therapy or something. While I could never hack it in teaching, I'm grateful I got a shot at YouTube, if only for the occasional message that I've helped somebody, feel better. Because I don't think I do a whole lot of helping. Mostly I just talk. But I've got receipts. You better believe I save every crumb of positive affirmation I get, because I need to know that what I can't give myself, I can at least give to someone else, somewhere. I think Ascension is worth trying, especially for longtime fans of the series, for a glimpse into something that no other game really approaches, even if other games in the series have comparable systems. The town building of Ascension would not exist without the town building of the PS2 titles, Rise to Power and Iron Triangle, which both involve careful placement of buildings on strategic plots of land to establish an economy and build resources. Neither of those games take the further step of removing unification as the player's main goal. It lets you simulate the life of a single person. And yes, playing as the daimyo is also playing as a single person, but those people are symbolically so much more. They're the face of a clan, a micro-nation. You can work your way up the chain of command, and in fact you're expected to, but it's also consensual. So if you enjoy simulating town construction and optimization, nobody's forcing a spear in your hand. Here, seasons turn and clouds pass, worldly troubles drift away, until your daimyo screams at you to do something and the illusion shatters. You still learn the basics of combat during the tutorial segment. It's a simplified version of the combat found in Sphere of Influence, with additional sieges and naval battles to round things out. You'll fight in battles regardless of your chosen place in the Empire, because as a retainer, a samurai sworn to the service of your daimyo, you're still a military commander. The critical thing about Ascension, though, is that failure is almost irrelevant. This was a revelation. In other games, I got steamrolled and game overed. A lot, honestly. A failure is inherent to Nobunaga's ambition. It's just that Ascension is willing to compromise on what that means. Early on, your daimyo will hand you a series of missions, optional goals to strive for that last for a set period of time. Collect X amount of lumber, generate X amount of gold, defeat this enemy officer, etc. Missions are helpful for structuring play. They give you a decent idea of what you should be doing with your time, especially for somebody who doesn't really get Nobunaga's ambition. And missions may be optional, but that doesn't mean they go uncompleted. They're actually shared with the broader pool of retainers in a given clan, meaning that Katsui Shibata might generate more lumber and complete the mission first. Though it's unlikely if you're really pushing, because the AI is simply not as sophisticated as the player. But regardless, you won't be punished for failure, you just won't climb ranks as fast. So I got to work constructing my town and doing whatever my lord requested. As the Oda clan, you're surrounded by all kinds of powerful enemies, but I didn't think about them, hardly at all. They weren't the target. X amount of lumber was the target. You've got to sweat the small stuff because that's exactly what you can handle at this stage of the game, with this amount of influence. So much of our lives are spent stressing about things we can't control, how the news will affect us, if the planet is dying, etc. And this is why purpose and responsibility are so powerful. They put the world in focus, so you know exactly what to prioritize. You can only control what's within your reach, and there's freedom in that. It's how I keep saying, making just stupid YouTube videos. This palpable charitability was illustrated most clearly when I lost a battle, ran my meager unit into an enemy I couldn't scratch, while assisting another retainer, by the way, and failed to win. And the game didn't instantly end. I wasn't captured or executed. The situation resolved itself without my input, and the game resumed. The point is, losing battles isn't uncommon in Nobunaga's ambition. You lose all the time unless you save scum your way to perfection. But Ascension offered a relatively stress-free experience. You might think of these sorts of strategy games as infinitely complex, impossible to look away from without sirens blaring and stocks plummeting, but I think a cold beer pairs real good with Nobunaga's ambition. I was enjoying my peaceful life in my peaceful fief in a castle near the coast. Eventually, though, the world caught up with me. I was given a mission that took me by surprise. It read, "Defeat Katsui Shibata in battle," which, for those unaware, Katsui Shibata was an Oda clan retainer and one of their most storied warriors. His deeds were so great, he landed a spot in Samurai Warriors, Sengoku Basara, and even in Nobunaga's Ambition, tends to sport some of the highest combat stats available in the region. Katsui Shibata is a legend, and more than that, he was one of the Oda clan's most loyal retainers. To see him defect to an enemy clan, the Imagawa, felt genuinely surreal. We were just working on lumber, bro. As you tend your lands, you'll occasionally be approached by agents of enemy clans and asked to defect yourself. Nothing is stopping the player from simply jumping ship to another clan. The hopes and dreams of whoever you serve are not necessarily your own. And the game doesn't have to end because your clan is being invaded. But in building up that land on your own, you develop a genuine sense of pride in your clan and your small contributions, and of a particular flavor otherwise unattainable elsewhere in the series. You can't defect when you're the daimyo of a clan. They kill people for that. Officers betraying you might be crushing in other games at a mechanical level, but here, well, this is personal. So I went to battle and managed to crush the famous Katsui Shibata with my own power, maybe 2 beers in. I felt something I hadn't previously imagined possible. Up until this point, I figured Nobunaga's ambition was too flat, too detached from individual humanity to mean much or express anything. But I was wrong. I sat there with the famous general at the tip of my spear thinking, you had this coming. You invited this with your faithlessness and your cowardice. Don't you know that Nobunaga Oda, when he actually comes of age, will be the man to unite this fractured country? Weren't you the steadfast one who chose, with a mere force of 400 faced with death by starvation, waited out by your cowardly foes to charge into the maw of death regardless and managed to repel that much larger force? Weren't you supposed to be trustworthy? Katsui Shibata paid with his life. Though I was eventually promoted and made to preside over a much larger region, suddenly responsible for filling out the county's surrounding fields, I felt like I also belonged there, where Katsui Shibata could not be. I stood instead. Masahide Hirate promised to raise Nobunaga and to protect him, and I rose to that higher aspiration even though it fundamentally changed the game. No longer was I concerned with the growth of my fief. All its land was inhabited. I could only demolish and build on top of what was already there, left to fiddle with the specifics or rise above. And the game of Empire calls for a wider view. I was already moving on. That, and I knew my time was running out. I left historical lifespans on, and through my time playing Nobunaga's Ambition, I knew this character eventually committed seppuku to jolt Nobunaga awake and out of his youthful fecklessness, to be mindful of his station and the people around him. Hirate suffered an incredible shame when Nobunaga, upon the death of his father, acted like an irreverent thug at his funeral. Just another reason he was called the Fool of Owari, and dashing any morale in the clan that his late father's heir would lead the clan to prosperity. Hirate's actions were drastic, but they were also indicative of the weight of Nobunaga's offense. Though he'd go on to achieve more in his life than almost any of his contemporaries, and specifically because of his lack of respect for tradition, the other people who he ruled over necessarily could not see the world how he did. And in a position of privilege, a position of power, the seat of daimyo demanded much more from the impetuous Nobunaga. It might be hard to understand if you've never found yourself in a position of privilege before. I also hate tradition and encourage everyone to try, but I was also a substitute high school teacher for a time, so to me, the context is a little more grounded. Being held to a higher standard is basically the first warning they give you. You're part of a union. You're expected to act in loco parentis, which means in place of the parent. If you walk into a bar and witness underage students that you know drinking alcohol, you're expected either to leave the premises or call the police. And if you're observed not following through on those obligations, acting in accordance to that exacting standard, you'll face a disciplinary hearing. Teaching is a scary step up from regular private citizenship. It means more eyes are on you, and it's simply a function of walking into that specific role. Those are the rules. Nobunaga had no real use for tradition, but the world around him, so immaterial, constantly shifting, had need of things people could commonly agree on: culture, honor, not being an asshole at your father's funeral. Speaking of, I love the occasional editorializing the authors get up to in the different games. In the one PS2 game, Rise to Power, Nobunaga is visited by the ghost of his father, who basically tells him to smarten up, and they maintain a pretty classic comedy duo act throughout. And this is a guy who went on to unify a huge portion of the country and act so ruthlessly they call him the Demon King in popular fiction. So his dad has to set him on the right path by teaching him about, where to build farms. It was that smaller view that taught me to sit with Nobunaga's ambition, and it was the broader view that taught me I needed to move on. After rising in rank, I found myself tabbing over to my fief, the one I'd carefully constructed over hours, realizing that maintaining it, optimizing it, wasn't enough. The battle with Katsui Shibata played and rewound in my mind as I gazed out over the larger province. I could replace the daimyo with enough concentrated effort, but soon enough my chosen retainer's life would end. While the game might give me the option to continue, inhabit some other body, I felt like my time with the game was ending. An NPC who appeared in town sometimes consistently repeated the phrase, "A man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream," alluding to the famous Atsumori quote, which was allegedly a favorite of Nobunaga's. This passage has been translated in more ways than is appropriate to broach in this kind of video. The words I spoke aloud as I showed the quote earlier do not entirely match, because I will be using a truncated version that's easier to say and slips off the tongue better for the remainder of the video. While it's derived from Atsumori, a famous novel play, it was apparently performed at least once by Nobunaga Oda before battle. At its core, the passage is ultimately about the impermanence of all things. The way, no matter how great any person is, they are but a single drop in a great stream, and any effort to resist the stream will eventually be met with failure. I've stuck it out through a lot of jobs in my life, a lot of unpleasant ones on that note, and while I'm all for challenging yourself, pushing what you think you can do, there's also a time to know when you're done. The best one was leaving substitute teaching for good. I didn't quit properly. Just fizzled out. But I did stop taking jobs. My channel was doing okay enough anyway, and I accepted a job from one of my frequent callers, the VP of the school I taught at most often. It was Sunday. I hated that job. And like a sign, a text hit my phone. After confirming me for the gig, the VP filled the position, somehow. The text read, "Actually, I don't need you anymore." And I thought, same. I realized that I wanted more from Nobunaga's ambition, and that if I could handle this microcosm of the broader vision, surely I could handle the real thing. I knew this feeling well. Several times in my life, I've been faced with the choice to do nothing, persistent stagnation, or to do something hard, and hopefully grow from it. I've definitely grown from all of those experiences, even if a lot of them really, really hurt. I did not inherit Nobunaga's ambition. I found it when my own vision of reality faltered, when I knew I wanted more and that the world I knew could no longer sustain me. After so many failed attempts at learning Nobunaga's ambition, and especially awakening, I decided to take a real shot. No matter what happened, no matter who attacked me, I would find a way. Even if I had to use a lot of save slots. I knew all of the commands already, from hours and hours of failure. What mattered was finding a safe place to put those pieces together, learn at my own pace. So I looked around for a small clan. One that wasn't completely useless, one that looked like it had a strong leader, and preferably one that wasn't anywhere near the cunning Imagawa or the Takeda Plague. I read in a forum post discussing a different Nobunaga's Ambition game, because so little information about the series exists in English, that the Chosokabe clan was nice and easy for that particular player, situated on remote Shikoku, far away from the constant battle in Kanto, and ideal for a learner. So I looked over, and sure enough, the Chosokabe ticked most of the boxes. It was a single castle, so not much to manage. It was surrounded by other single castles helmed by below-average officers, making Shikoku a veritable produce aisle ripe for picking. And the daimyo, Kunichika Chosokabe, looked exactly like the kind of person who could change a tire. I mean, I can too. I taught myself how to do that, this year even. It's like he and I are basically the same. I set the difficulty to something sane and made sure historical events were kept on. And so began my longest and greatest game of Nobunaga's Ambition. Setting up a castle is easy. I had nothing. No farms, no markets, no barracks, so I made a priority of spending as many labor points as possible developing a trickle of income. A player can only make so many orders in a short time. Most buildings cost 3 out of your likely 4 labor points. You can also upgrade a facility in your home base for a single labor point. You spend a lot of time watching time march on. Every clan has different needs. Some are privileged with gold, and others with powerful soldiers. What makes a clan interesting or unique is very often invisible. You might only want to play as a powerful, known historical warlord with a striking portrait, but that kind of campaign is only one flavor of game. Some excel in agriculture and others in diplomacy. The Chosokabe excel in none of these. Like with people, potential is sometimes only made obvious with time. I eschewed the most famous warlords in part because they were obvious. There seemed to be nothing innately rewarding about punching down on the rest of Kanto with some bloated 7-castle mob boss. Nobunaga's Ambition is a game that both rewards and admonishes the sociopath with plain presentation. Hell yeah, exclaims the type of person who pulls the legs off ants with tweezers as his brutal Takeda death squad tramples the trembling Murakami, while everyone else looks on in abject horror. As I sat stewing and building, one of my officers suggested, completely independently, that we undermine another castle by lighting it on fire. I was so happy to finally have on my side, for once, a scheming vizier. Though in this case it was actually a retainer with the devious trait, and we went ahead. Surprisingly, the plan worked, and I realized I could mobilize in that moment. My Chosokabe soldiers tore through enemy ranks, debased their castle, until only we stood atop the battlements, banners high. Suddenly, more excited for having done something right, I started up diplomacy with a clan on the coast and responded instantly to a border dispute. If I act like a responsible warlord, if I take this seriously and play the part, maybe I'll actually succeed. Or so I told myself. You can do a lot of things right, from showing up on time to looking the part, and stay stuck regardless. I'm reminded of a faux pas I made while substituting at a local high school. Fresh on the job, back in my own high school, I came across another substitute teacher making photocopies. Hey, I know you. You were a substitute when I was going here. And he smiled kind of weakly and made small talk, just a hint of sadness in his eye, and I realized later that this was a person who struggled getting a full-time job as a high school teacher because nobody thought he was good enough. The vice principal confirmed this with me later. He's never going to do this full-time. This story has a happy ending. By the way, I saw him sometime later, working another job. Maybe I pushed him over the edge to make a change. I'm not sure. But he was there, smiling. For my sake, I have to believe people can escape the places they aren't valued and thrive. My devious retainer consistently offered up plots. Some I greenlit and others I refused, but I slowly set to work building my territories and undermining my enemies, While underhanded actions against neighboring clans aren't particularly effective all of the time, they shine in low-stakes, low-power scenarios like this, in the Shikoku region. Here, talented officers are few, combat is relatively light, and officer loyalty is low. It's Hicktown. Everyone wants out, or better. If you spread rumors about enemy daimyos, their officers will slowly lose loyalty, and you'll eventually have the opportunity to extract them and take them into your ranks. And to be clear, officers are Nobunaga's ambition. Without officers, players can't do anything. The daimyo is an officer as well, but you, the daimyo, are just as limited by your mortal shell as anyone else. You can't be 3 places at once. Believe me, I've been double booked by idiot vice principals. It's just... And sometimes you get neither job but paid anyway. So you delegate most work that ever happens in game. If a farm needs tilling, you delegate. If a plot needs hatching, you delegate. If a dam breaks, if you want to write policy, you know. Admittedly, combat units don't require an officer to lead them, but they become much less effective without the stats and abilities which would otherwise be conferred to that unit by a commanding officer. So thieving an enemy clan's retainer, when talent trickles from the faucet and seeps up from the earth in droplets at a time, is crushing, genuinely powerful. Politics can be just as heavy-hitting as open conflict, sometimes in invisible ways. After taking who I could, I set about conquering a second castle and succeeded. There's no fanfare in these earliest battles. You simply select an enemy castle and march to hurl a wave of meat and swords at them, or select your own individual castles to march, wherever you like. Marches are hampered by resources, crops, which you generate with farms. To do anything in Nobunaga's ambition requires a balance of resources: soldiers, crops, money, officers, and those are only the material needs. Invisible factors impact the game as well. Prestige, that is, how famous or infamous your clan is, has a particular impact on larger scale battles and other less violent negotiations. Clan alliances and your own political status can impact who you can invade and what the consequences of invasion might be. Time is everything. For people who never studied economics, opportunity cost is the potential gain of any missed opportunity. If you quickly attack a clan instead of waiting to build up an overwhelming army of soldiers, you might get the castle earlier, saving time and generating more resources faster. Who among us effectively uses their time? I do, but people definitely think I'm a social reprobate for it. You have played Nobunaga's ambition before, every day. Another quirk of more modern takes on the series is the addition of historical cutscenes, which I appreciate about Awakening because they're skippable, ignorable, and actually framed well, unlike its forebear, Sphere of Influence. I don't know, guys. These are some tall ceilings or some very short men. I learned that the Miyoshi clan was undergoing some kind of regime change and didn't pay much attention to it, which was a critical mistake. Things change politically in-game, all of the time, because Nobunaga's ambition is a historical simulation game. That timeline has nothing to do with your actions unless you manage to throw an unexpected wrench in things. Far away in the east, 2 clans will be merged together by the shogun. The head of a house will die in an assassination attempt. A daimyo steps down and becomes a Buddhist monk. History rolls on, regardless of your input. I remember hearing unfair things about that hapless, decade-long substitute and thinking, well, I'll just do things correctly. Needless to say, I'm talking in front of a camera right now. Feeling like I wasn't acting quickly enough, I ignored the no-good, bum-ass Imperial Court's request for donations, who thieved my money at every turn in my very first campaign with no obvious benefit, and sent my troops at a 3rd castle. Taking small castles early is empowering. Like anyone who's ever rolled a small snowball into a whole bulbous snowman's bottom chunk, the neurons in my brain desperately wanted to see how far I could take things. But I made a mistake. The minute Chosokabe banners flew at the border of Miyoshi territory, they turned their combined forces against me. More than 20,000 soldiers to my 6,000? I tried to keep that castle. I fought them repeatedly, but I realized that, like my doomed Saito playthrough, if a bigger clan wants to crush you, they can, and will. In that moment, the treasonous, pestilent Miyoshi became my greatest enemy. Playing the scenario back multiple times, I found that I could not fight the rat bastard Miyoshi head on, and I could not expand too far without attracting Miyoshi attention and instantly losing. I also realized I could not assault the keep to the left. It was too well fortified and, thanks to one of its highly loyal officers, was effectively immune to schemes. Some officers have defensive abilities that keep certain strategies in check. This is the great challenge and the joy of early Nobunaga's ambition. You need to find a way to create victory. You don't get the opportunity to let loose the dogs of war or light the countryside ablaze. You meet impossible tests. And so you change the conditions of the test. So I did something that hurt my pride to survive. I pledged loyalty to the Miyoshi. I vassalized. You can become a vassal, a subservient clan to a larger clan, through the diplomacy tab. Vassalizing isn't always a good play. It effectively halts your ability to form diplomatic relations with other clans. It restricts your freedom. But if you're existentially threatened in every other future, it can also save you. In my case, it meant an instant alliance, meaning they would generally ignore my actions in the greater Shikoku region. They held no other alliances with the neighboring clans, and realistically speaking, they had bigger fish to fry in the Kinki region. Even though I lit my personal feelings on fire, I did what I believed I had to do to succeed. After all, the Chosokabe clan was bigger than me, bigger than Kunichika. You have to imagine your individual castles as representing thousands of people, and you're responsible for their well-being, which could never happen under the oppressive and cowardly regime of the villainous Miyoshi, but I was forced to leave their citizens to suffer that tyranny for now. Regardless, when you find yourself in a position of responsibility, you have to put your personal feelings aside. In 2015, 2 years before landing a job in a Canadian high school, I took a job in South Korea as a teacher in a small hakwan, or private school, which is, or at least was, fairly common, because they'll take just about anyone who speaks English natively, and with a degree, a teaching degree as well, they'll hire you on the spot. Aptitude and motivation aren't really a part of the screening process, just credentials. While this job was more frustrating and personally challenging than any other job I'd held up until that point, I stuck it out for the entire year, even when it became unbearable, because I was there to make money. It may be a less than noble motivation, but specifically, I was earning money to marry my fiancée, now my wife, and to pad my college-fresh teaching resume out so I could smoothly transition from Korean private school to Canadian public school. I remember a lot of small moments, but one of the worst happened very quickly, in early October. The teacher I was replacing, my trainer, didn't actually do much to explain the specifics of the daily schedule, and mostly demonstrated what he did. We had to teach students out of 3 booklets that each accounted for a month of material. Without specific instruction to do otherwise, I taught out of the books without a strict order, sometimes advancing in one and sometimes advancing in another. I later found out they were to be delivered in a particular order. And in failing to realize this, because nobody actually told me, the head teacher's wife, the wife of the man who hired me and drove me around setting up my bank information and helped me get a temporary Korean cell phone, his wife, stormed into my classroom and yelled at the students. She raged at me in all Korean as well. I had no idea what she was actually saying, but I realized she was yelling at them as well. Presumably me, but mostly them. And so, upon slamming the door behind her, the children all came rushing from their chairs to hug me, crying, saying they were sorry, in English. 5-year-olds. I had no idea what happened except that this woman was incredibly upset, but that she chose to, for some reason, terrorize the students and cause all of that. Well, that stuck with me permanently. I understand what I was doing wrong, not that anybody made that apparent, and especially in any kind of constructive way. I think I may have made the other teachers' jobs more confusing for a couple of weeks, but the image is burned into my brain. I never looked at that person the same way again, even after we'd made up. I almost quit that day. But I made promises and committed to seeing something through. I didn't want to fail, so I gritted my teeth and carried on, even when I really regretted it later. So, Having established my safety from the Miyoshi, I turned once again to my scheming vizier. His plots allowed me to slowly drain the talent of multiple clans in the region as I invested in my own castles, and one by one, like dominoes or skittles, they fell to my ever-growing army. These clans were so run-of-the-mill, so backwater, so irrelevant. I can't remember a single one of their names. And I will not dignify them by looking them up. I mentioned time. Time is always moving forward. Around this time, Kunichika's son came of age, Morochika Chosokabe. He looked really cool. Not as mandoodly as Kunichika, but intense and noble in his posture. Instead of my scheming vizier, Morochika pitched a plan to raise the final available enemy castle, which was previously too well protected by its own talent. But Morochika's plan worked, and with the castle in flames, I marched my combined forces on the Ichijo. It was a protracted battle, but I was well prepared. When the dust cleared, I assigned my son, Morochika, to rule that castle. It only seemed appropriate because his actions directly resulted in the capture. And then I got a cutscene. Morochika Chosokabe wasn't anything resembling a warrior, in his youth at least. He was softer, apparently owing to his upbringing, but he was earnest and polite, and eager to learn and impress. The other soldiers thought he was a fool, probably incapable of leading the Chosokabe one day, but his instructor believed in his potential. He was even mocked for his soft nature, leading to the nickname Himewako, or Little Princess. Thinking back on it, I'd been called plenty of names in the past, and too nice by students and teachers alike, in either country, and an angel by some of my Korean co-teachers. Despite being a recovering cynic, I've clung to that self-image as a person who wants people to be happy, feel respected, or taken seriously. This never did me any good. By the way, it maybe made people feel worse for me, but they also probably didn't respect me anyway. I couldn't believe I lucked into a character, a historical Japanese warlord, that reminded me, in some small way, of myself. Jumping out of the chair and shrieking, "He just like me for real!" This was the moment I found something close to genuine allegiance to my own selected clan, formed some unbreakable spiritual bond with this ancient and possibly distant samurai kin group. I related to a historical figure, over the ways he was treated as lesser by the Warring States period version of boomers. If I started reciting the ways I've been doubted and distrusted and mocked by men older than me for not living up to some confabulated standard, I won't have time for the rest of the video. Of course, I also realized after a quick Google search exactly who Morochika Chosokabe was. In searching for a small clan and taking another person's advice, I'd missed the chance to play a real nobody clan. The Chosokabe were a prominent Shikoku power that dominated the region historically, at times serving under the Ichijo and the Miyoshi, and eventually under Nobunaga. Even worse, I knew who this was. I just forgotten the name. I'm terrible with names, like I can remember text easily enough, but when it's a romanized, wholly different language, it's significantly harder for me. You try meeting 75 to 100 people a day when you first start substitute teaching. Eventually, they're all just you. Morochika Chosokabe was the shamisen guy from Samurai Warriors, this pasty twink. What? A fascinating way to represent this particular character. It's true that he was historically called Himewako, again, Little Princess, and was also referred to by his eventual lord, Nobunaga, as a bat on an island without birds. So he basically called him a jobber, which must have led to his self-stated title in Samurai Warriors, the Bat King. But these two people are not even remotely alike. I almost prefer Sengoku Basara's take on the character. Yes, he's wielding an oversized comical anchor weapon because, for some reason, the Chosokabe are treated like pirates, which has no real historical basis, but at least it's an understandable and almost grounded take. They hail from the island of Shikoku. You need a boat to cross the channel. It basically tracks. I guess it could have been worse. They could have done him like Haruhisa Amago. Emboldened by my success in Shikoku, I turned to Kyushu just across the channel, hoping to establish a foothold and expand into the Shimazu and Otomo lands. While I easily took down the first castle I saw, I could not take Soren Otomo's home base. I realized that there were limits to my expansion. This failure stuck with me for some time. followed me for hours. I found myself reflecting on my life and experiences during the whole of my time with Nobunaga's ambition. It's a series about how lives and fates play out. But it even managed to simulate the ugly things, the way you'll find yourself obsessing over others if you ever find yourself in a professional capacity surrounded by other, more successful people, both in teaching and in YouTube. That clan has stronger officers. That clan has numbers, but they're weak to plots. That clan's on the decline. That clan's on the rise. It's nothing to be proud of, but a hard truth that when you're unstable, you covet stability, status, and see the things you most desire reflected in other people who have what you want, but can never give it in return. How do I get like that? What is it gonna take? And it's not like onlookers don't draw comparisons. Comparison is misery, and it's something you will never escape for daring to walk in a public space. You're not like the last teacher. You're not as good as this other person. You'd be better if... And while we're always learning and always growing, growth is not necessarily rewarded. Results are. My goal was expansion because it's the goal of the game, but it's also a preventative measure against invasion. The larger you are, the less likely an enemy clan will prey on you, the less likely you are to become a victim. Vassal status and therefore protection also becomes untenable at some point. When you become sufficiently large, you can no longer operate as a vassal. Instead, you're forced to identify as a threat. I needed to build up my defenses in Shikoku to wall off the Miyoshi, who were still thankfully entrenched in various Kinki excursions, but also the Otomo and Shimazu. Left to their own devices, one would eventually triumph over the other on the mainland, and Kyushu would become an impenetrable fortress. I recognized that it was necessary to drive a wedge between them, but I pushed too early. I've often thought the same of my teaching career: too young, too early, too naive. Both of those clans are powerful with brutally effective officers and significant defense. And invasions aren't always as simple as they look. You might click to order an invasion, but geographical limitations, including a lack of roads, will prevent marching. You ideally want to collapse on any given castle from multiple angles, a pincer attack, but it's unfeasible in many cases, unless you have an officer who can suggest specialized military road work to assist. And my talent pool was still pretty shallow. It's at times like these, players need to turn to their unique capabilities. The Chosokabe have access to a policy that nobody else has, even if the Imagawa clan and others have similar ones. And multiple officers, if appointed to official clan council positions, can reduce the upkeep cost of maintaining said policy. Chosokabe Militia, which lets soldiers regenerate at castles faster than average, meaning you can swarm enemies more efficiently, partially eliminating the need for fancy road work and tactics. I read Motochika Chosokabe's 100-article code of the Chosokabe. Read it like a book. I would find a way. But for all my career nepotism, all my solipsistic and self-obsessed genius, I could not push into Kyushu. An officer I liked, died in battle against the Shimazu. Not as part of an official, mechanics-regulated battle, just a common field skirmish. Cut down in a second. Eventually, the veritable beehive of the broader Ultimo clan were fed up with my constant prodding and kicked me out of the region wholesale, snatching back the castle I took and slamming the door behind me. I lost. With the door to Kyushu sealed and part of Shikoku impenetrable, the craven Miyoshi sitting to my right, I had only one option. And it was an ugly option. The Mori clan dominated most of Chigoku, hampered only by the floundering Oichi and the declining Imago. Cutting into their territory would probably pose just as much of a problem as Kyushu. Did you know, before I started YouTube, I planned it for a year, recorded a bunch of games and wrote a bunch of scripts. They were terrible, but everything starts terrible. Can't develop the muscle without working them first, and I was doing it on the side, working hours a day in my Korean Hakwan, 9 hours a day, and then coming home and working on something else until the next day. It made me a total recluse. I made friends and got out. A lot of them had to haul me out, but I was so obsessed with the idea of becoming something. See, I finished teacher's college, did my practice teaching, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy. Afterwards, I went to Korea and realized this stuff was really hard. It didn't come naturally at all. 2, 3 years later, as a rapidly disillusioned high school substitute and a slowly growing YouTuber, I remember the walls closing in and being faced with the choice to throw everything into one risky play for stability, something that could, maybe, work for me this time. If it didn't take off, I really don't know where I'd be. As though the game heard my cry of frustration, a typhoon swept in from the skies and mostly battered Chogoku all along the coast, exactly where I'd have to land. I took this typhoon for an omen. Bad things happen all the time in Nobunaga's ambition. Famine, natural disasters, these things don't overturn whole civilizations, but they create chaos, and therefore opportunity. They're also impossible to control. You can get hit by a typhoon while your neighbor gets off scot-free. And that's just life. I set my army upon southern Chogoku, swallowing the smaller clans along the way. The nature of conflict itself altered. Single castle clans were no longer the enemy, just necessary pit stops, speed bumps on the warpath. The real enemy was the Mori, and they showed me, in a few short in-game years, the joy of Nobunaga's ambition. There are effectively 3 kinds of war in Awakening. Ambient, non-instanced land skirmishes, which account for most of the early game, but also account for any suitably average conflict. Battles which only trigger, and consensually by the way, when appropriate important forces collide, generally upper-level officers from either side, and finally sieges which need to be greenlit with a certain policy and only concern major castles, so the current home base of any particular clan. My conquest of Chogoku happened incredibly quickly, in a series of 3 consecutive conflicts. The first 2 were regular battles, Kunichika Chosokabe staring down the strongest enemy officers on the field of battle. Open conflict is very different in other Nobunaga's Ambition games. Sphere of Influence, for example, allowed players to place armies as directable blobs on a vast, undetailed expanse and made directional combat important, alongside ability micromanagement. Ascension's siege battles were different. Blobs of units, again helmed by an officer, battered down any single castle until either side lost. Awakening keeps battle on tracks, like roller coaster tracks, which is maybe more helpful than you'd expect. It means nothing weird or mechanically confusing happens, once you understand what you're looking at. Units move however you direct them, but they're fully stopped when they meet opposing forces. They lose stamina and need to take breaks if you can help it. You can easily surround enemies and beat them down quicker in that way. Numbers matter, or specifically, how many units you deploy matters. Victory conditions range from mopping up every blob of enemies to cutting off their escape route by smashing their deployment point, if you can manage to skirt around the back and burn it down. While the Mori forces were generally larger and the clan itself maintained a level of continental prestige that far outstripped the Chosokabe, I found myself finally using everything I'd learned in my previous failed attempts, and even my failures in Kyushu, to outmaneuver and beat them back. Every single time. The first time I beat the Mori in battle, because of the prestige difference, I triggered authority. I don't think I could ever get tired of how this feels. Authority is an Awakening-specific mechanic designed to make the process of conquering any given region less frustrating, less granular, by allowing the victor of an important battle to seize multiple nearby castles for free with a sufficiently strong burst of authority, generally triggered by higher stakes. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. The first time I triggered authority, I only managed to agitate nearby castles, stopping them from marching in retaliation. Adding to the notion that balance is hardly a factor, authority is a death spiral mechanic, meaning if you get hit by a blast of authority and you're the smaller clan, or facing someone who can rapidly repopulate, if you're unlucky enough to lose officers and castles in that way, it only becomes harder to pull yourself back. It's life on the edge out here in Sengoku period Japan. Thankfully, I'd been a full-time YouTuber for 5 years at this point, and the Mori simply couldn't rise to that level of depravity. Well, Motonori, you ever flopped 7 videos in a row before? You ever fallen off and brought it all back multiple times? Next, I beat up Motonori Mori's son, one of the strongest officers in the area, someone with his own unique combat ability. As some of history's greatest warriors are granted special combat tactics. For example, Motochika Chosokabe has one that replenishes stamina, morale, etc. When my opponent's forces painted the ground, I did not trigger authority because the game determined that the stakes were not sufficiently high enough, which was mostly true. And besides, I was heading into a siege against the Mori clan's home base. That was the fight that mattered. It felt pretty incredible being responsible for victories that Kunichika Chosokabe never achieved in his own lifetime, and spearheaded by his son. I felt like Motochika must have felt fulfilled at some point in that moment, finally moving beyond the nickname Wakahime and into his eventual final nickname.
I will show you how I, Motochika, came to be known as the Little Demon.
Not that the Chosokabe ever defeated the Mori or seized their lands, but by this point I was writing my own history. Seizing the opportunity to rout the Mori for good and claim their land for myself, I rapidly built up my armies and pressed the attack. A third critical time. I faced Motonori Mori's eldest legitimate son, Takamoto Mori. This was the first proper siege of a Mori castle, and it was tough. When I first entered a siege battle, way back when, I failed to understand how supplies factored into battle. But with a strong economy, a modest stockpile, and by targeting key infrastructure during the siege to keep morale high, Kunichika finally toppled the great Mori stronghold.
The people will hear of our victory.
I triggered authority again, and because of the gravity of the victory, 2 nearby Mori castles defected to join my cause, officially making the Mori clan minor by comparison. Smaller than the Imago, smaller than the Uchi. But I wouldn't be satisfied vassalizing them, I needed them lining my ranks. Officers are everything, and Mori officers are some of the strongest in Western Japan. By rapidly eating up smaller clans and acquiring castles, I ran into one of Nobunaga's ambition's greatest challenges: officer management. Eventually, you need to put someone in charge of a castle to make its production of resources efficient, and you need to build up those castles the way you so carefully did with your first single castle, which ultimately means unlocking the abilities to let your officers handle it for you, as small matters escape your attention, or as your attention settles on matters so much larger than those which seemed so significant so long ago. This personnel shortage is also why I'd let every captured officer live if they refuse to join my clan. You can execute them at your discretion, they're your prisoners of war, but people beat at the heart of any empire. So I let as many stay in constant circulation as possible. Some will join other clans in the fight against you. Some will seemingly disappear forever. You don't wage war to snuff out life, but to preserve it. Or so I told myself as I flung enormous comical boulders on my enemies and edited silly sound effects under my narration. And then, my daimyo, me, Kunichika Chosokabe, finally got the chance to cross swords with Motonori Mori before his final castle fell. No matter how many times I fought them, they never surrendered, never begged for a truce. They fought with everything they had. I realized I was forming something of a parasocial relationship with these clans. They acted in particular ways. They had rules and mechanics that parsed something like beliefs and convictions. They had cutscenes which gave me some kind of insight, however minimal, into their personalities. And when I finally moved to take the Mori's final castle, just as I'd mobilized my forces and given the final order, Kunichika Chosokabe died. He died of old age. If you allow for historical lifespans for people to enter and exit the stage how history demands, you will experience sudden loss, and more often than you'd expect. It sat with me for a while, because it doesn't seem all that important with any broader view of history. But this was a man whose life was mostly centered in Shikoku, who lived under the thumb of powerful warlords his entire life. And while he pressed the advantage and pushed beyond his means, any normal person's means to accomplish great deeds, none of them historically ever matched upending the Mori clan and conquering most of Shikoku. None of them ever really matched Motonori Mori himself. Did I give him a better life than he got? I put my life on the line, but a unified nation eluded my grasp. And so far away from home, just before the final triumphant battle. I chose his son, Motochika, to succeed as daimyo, the character I identified with and struck into the world with, became the character I inhabited. With this burning resolve, I tore the Mori clan asunder in a furious final siege and took their officers. As I rapidly found a need to staff the many castles I'd acquired, I decided to use the Mori to conquer Chigoku in my name. This, I thought, is what it means to be a warlord. I decorated my officers with titles and bribed the new, less loyal officers with gifts. Officer loyalty is arguably as important as what they offer. Maintaining an empire is maintaining its people, but also its morale. Loyalty is boosted by winning in battle, capturing castles, triggering authority, by maintaining your officer's belief in your dream. If an officer falls ill and you lose consecutive battles, they can die right there from the shame. Chasing a dream as mind-bendingly vast as unifying Japan is the same as running on wispy, rapidly vanishing, self-placed stepping stones, running headlong into the horizon. And not everyone can lay those stones, and no one can maintain them forever. I don't think there's anyone older than 30 who doesn't think about suddenly dying. I don't think there's anyone who's self-employed who does art, who doesn't worry about the day it all falls apart. By the time any of us find out we're being weighed in the balance, we'll have already been weighed in the balance. As I digested all that happened between Shikoku and the Mori, another cutscene began. Nobunaga Oda killed the storied daimyo of the Imagawa clan in a nighttime raid under the cover of rain. Yoshimoto Imagawa has a pretty interesting legacy in popular fiction, and particularly video games. He was one of the most dominant warlords in his time, someone who others thought might one day unify Japan. But the story goes he grew complacent in his incursion against the Oda. And when he found himself routed, his dream dead in a blink, and his empire faded to a rapid decline, he was punished for his crimes of being ambushed at night one time with total comedic reduction in Samurai Warriors and also Sengoku Basara.
Who do you think I am?
Okay, let's take it down a notch, Rob Schneider. Yoshimoto Imagawa, an almost mythical persona and survivor of many battles, was turned into a foppish, dallying imbecile. But context is a luxury reserved for the victorious and the sympathetic. Try to put yourself in Yoshimoto's shoes. If you were suddenly slain in the night by your enemy, commanding a much smaller force than you, and some 400 years later people were representing you as a bumbling idiot, I think it'd at least haunt the art team. What if you died in a horrific sudden shipwreck, like the Titanic, and centuries later, some punk drew you as a paunchy, overdressed socialite and drew a funny flamingo floaty around your waist? Now, he is a perfect symbolic individual for a dying era. Nobunaga swept in using tactics that most people wouldn't attempt. The attack was massively risky, and their strike team was puny. If anyone simply ordered a regroup and maintained the march, it's entirely possible Nobunaga's dream would have dissipated much earlier. Instead, the moment stands in infamy as the cultural needle drop for a new age, and it's why the games fixate so much on this moment, devoting precious cutscene time to recreating it whenever possible. It's easy to understand the impulse. These stories, told through games, need characters, clashing personalities, and strong narratives. The drama of an era of war, different forces vying for dominance, makes for good entertainment. But I appreciate Nobunaga's ambition, and eventually the latest Samurai Warriors entry, for recognizing his actual historical accomplishments by letting him keep his visual dignity and resisting the pull towards juvenalian satire. Regardless, he dies all the same, and his clan is thrust into the hands of his incompetent son. This is officially the beginning of Nobunaga's legend, who was previously viewed as an ingrate, the fool of Owari, a disrespectful idiot, someone whose head would end up on a stick one day. Nobunaga was successful for many reasons, but the two main reasons were his general lack of respect for tradition and his ruthlessness, meaning he was willing to acquire firearms from Portuguese traders and pepper his enemies with bullets, while they were still clinging to notions of honorable combat, spearmen, and cavalry. Nobunaga recognized that the rules of combat were confabulated by very old people, that constant civil war and feudalism ultimately aided in breaking those rules, and that the winds of change were blowing well before he stepped on a battlefield. and I had to race him. If you let any prominent clan or the Oda fester where they sprout for too long, they will eat up as much territory as you and become massive installations that demand intentional dismantling. Authority helps, but you only actually topple a clan completely by taking their home base, which they can swap to another of their castles after losing their previous one, retaining all of their officers. This makes authority almost mandatory against larger clans, at least with the way Awakening is designed. For anything less than a hair-pulling experience, racing the Oda wouldn't be overly challenging. I had the rest of Chigoku, all of Kyushu, and the vile Miyoshi to siphon from before reaching Nobunaga. I just hoped I'd get there in time. Even with the Mori dismantled and assimilated, Kyushu was looking like a problem. The Shimazu controlled the bulk of the coastline, and the Otomo maintained a solid chunk in the center. If they worked together and opted for mutual stagnation holding to what they had, I'd never have broken through. But that isn't how warlords operate. Forget feudal Japan. Empires worldwide have gone to war explicitly for the sake of seizing land and resources, even for the sake of prestige and entitlement. Nothing to do with survival. Many wars on Earth were historically fought under weak pretenses, with the end goal being self-aggrandizing expansionism. It was rarely a matter of justice, but rather a matter of power consolidation, ensuring one's own peerlessness. This is ultimately what drove me to unify Japan. I could pretend my motivations were pure, but then my narrative about the ontologically evil Miyoshi would never fly. My vassal status under the Miyoshi ran its course naturally because I was overly focused on quashing the Mori and grew too large. While I proposed a truce in place of vassal status, that also fizzled out over time. The second it ended, they mobilized their entire military, which was at least as substantial as mine. I was forced to call another truce on the spot, and it required burning up an earlier alliance with the Shimazu, something I only did to keep them off my back. But doing so destroyed Motochika's popularity. Suddenly many officers, even longtime officers, were looking incredibly dissatisfied and liable to jump ship. How you appear is incredibly important in-game. Going back on an agreement, even if only to preserve your safety, is enough to make people question your character. So I was put on the spot. Win back as much honor as possible to keep the officers placated, and the only way to reliably and universally boost honor is conquest. However, even with my crushing military might, at least compared to the rest of the Western clans, I was unable to definitively overthrow the Miyoshi clan, and I'd already struggled in Kyushu. As I determined my next target, I got another cutscene. Nagayoshi Miyoshi, who'd been my greatest adversary, actually reached the end of his natural lifespan. He forced his brother to commit seppuku, withered in illness, and left the fate of the clan in the hands of Hisahide Matsunaga. The Miyoshi, as I'd known them, effectively ceased to exist. Their shell lingered on, castles, most of their officers, and I still despised them, but the man who dog-walked me up and down Shikoku passed away entirely on his own, the face that cropped up in every crisis, and it made the conflict feel hollow. Fake. I happened to have a job that most people won't. Held over a sufficiently long period of time, you will see yourself become many different people, and in a way that's louder than the average person. If you work at a coffee shop your whole life, for example, it's unlikely that how you express yourself will radically change over the years, except through getting older, crankier, more bitter, etc. Working my job, I see my own mode of expression bubble and shift in real time, even over the course of months, as I adopt new perspectives, learn more, develop ideas, and consider feedback. You watch yourself change, and you watch others change. Of course, there is no real preparation for the march of time. One day you're running all alongside these other people doing similar things, even if it's at a distance. And the next, that person, those people, stop uploading, stop existing. In that space, at least. And everything is different. And nothing has changed. And it's always humbling because it dates you and places you in a broader lineage. Here and now, for so many years, these people and I lived parallel lives in entirely separate worlds, different countries, different outlooks, and then they stop. And it happens a lot. And you wonder when your turn is coming. And you realize you can't answer what will happen if your job ever stops existing, because we've never actually seen someone work a whole 30-plus year career on YouTube. It hasn't existed that long. If it happens, you just gotta figure it out. Your future is impossible to parse, for better or worse. I didn't think of Nobunaga's ambition as an evocative game at first pass, but it routinely begged for my input, constantly drew parallels to things I'd experienced and people I'd known. Nobunaga's ambition, I realized, was art, and in a way that manifested above mere categorization. Not, it's art because it's a game and games are art. Yeah, sure, but art demands something from the viewer to truly speak. Nobunaga's ambition demanded a lot. Reflections aside, Kyushu needed immediate attention. The Miyoshi still had greater numbers, so I marched west from above and sailed into the side from Shikoku. The Otomo decided to fight back instead of begging for a truce, and I found myself staring down Dosetsu Tachibana, the father of one of the only battlefield-viable women retainers in the game, Ginshio Tachibana, and one of the strongest samurai in the West. Sort of like the Katsue Shibata of the Otomo. Maybe through sheer luck, I managed to pull ahead and rout him in combat, but I was given the chance to recruit him myself, execute him, or release him. When he refused to join, I felt suddenly that this was a person too strong to let live. If he ran free, he'd only become a problem later on. And you're not always given the chance to drain a clan's best retainers, not like how it was on Tiny Shikoku. For the first time, I chose to execute an opponent.
I have no regrets.
I'd let every single officer live up until this point because I was warned, reading through forums, that execution served no greater function except in the case where an officer might be more trouble than they're worth to keep alive. His death only served as a grim reminder of my resolve. In the game of Empire, you're always playing for keeps. With the Mori clan's greatest officers chewing through the Otomo in the north and carving a path through the region with raw military might, I snatched up exactly as much of Kyushu as I could handle, knowing that if either clan rose against me, I could divert my attention from the west and end them permanently. Because my real target was the Miyoshi. I'd wanted regional unity in Shikoku since I started taking castles. Unifying your own turf is just the first step to a unified Japan. And the Miyoshi forced me, with their size and power, to submit, to heel like a dog. Well, there's one thing you can never count on in Nobunaga's ambition, and that's permanence. As the old quote goes, a man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. With Nagayoshi Miyoshi dead and the clan's power in decline, I turned my blade eastward. As the sun rose, not physically, but in a metaphorical sense that complements the image, the combined forces of the Chosokabe clan rose up, securing a route from the north because no military masterstroke is complete without a pincer attack, and vassalizing the fading Imago to prevent extraneous disruption from further east, I ordered a full march on the Miyoshi. Officers died in battle, but their castles toppled one after another, earth trembling from the thunderous hooves of 30,000 steeds until my most dire foe was shoved fully out of Shikoku. That is, minus the island castle connecting them to Kinki, my scheming retainer who'd been with me through so much, stewing his dark designs every step of the way, died of old age during the war's final stages, maybe only hanging on long enough to see Kunichika's dream made manifest, a Shikoku ruled by the Chosokabe. I got a cutscene in the aftermath, a monk wisely telling Motochika not to extend beyond his reach lest he lose control of what he owns. I'd received advice like this for most of my life. Most people are not built for dreams. I think the average guy who gets a stable job and marries and has kids is probably living better than me, unconcerned about how he's perceived and who he has to impress, maybe outside of his own family, and operating with plenty of obligations, but also a reason to persist. Many young people fear things like marriage and children, responsibility, and it's an understandable fear, a total paradigm shift in your life. But what they don't see due to a lack of experience is the way those challenges, the way pressure can form diamond, direction, purpose, resolve. These are the lifeblood of dreams. When nothing else can sustain you, that fire to do or create, even when it presents as cold discipline, that will carry you. When you can't count on anything else, you can always count on having more to do. The only thing that separates this imagined average person from a person who spawns a dream from the ether is hunger. Raw, intrinsic motivation, fire, the kind that eats you alive. It's dangerous chasing a dream. When you never leave your walls, your safety, you're never made vulnerable to failure. Even if you succeed, you find that dreams aren't everything. If you manage to accomplish the dream, you'll find yourself with another. We're all so full of dreams. Nobunaga's ambition might not have created dreams for me, but it definitely created ambitions. Learn how to play, unify Shikoku, unify Japan. Most people are not built for dreams. Kunichika lived his whole life keeping his foundations sturdy and expanding conservatively, careful not to push his boundaries. His dream, his real dream, the one recorded in history books, is painted in his actions, preserving what little the clan had. And even here, in my fictional rewrite, he died before he could see his dream fully realized, in spite of accomplishing so much. But now, in this revised history, Motochika, I stood before the door to greatness, Nobunaga himself. Reaching him would be another matter entirely. I needed a new scheming vizier, and I found Ukita Naoi. Kind of amazing you can visit the vizier store for a new one. I guess when you plunder half of Japan. I wasn't actually aware of his abilities, but when I set siege to his castle and brought him into the fold, I could tell he was something special. This was a man who'd inherited Nobunaga's ambition. One of the 3 great villains of Japan. Mitsuhide isn't even in that trio. Imagine looking like this. The Chosokabe Empire was growing far out of control. I was forced to move home bases multiple times and expand my own territorial control using policies, implementing a postal service to keep my people productive. Without leadership and beyond the potential reach of the daimyo, a clan's edges falter and fray in disrepair. I kept running into officer shortages, and old officers kept shuffling off, often en masse, whether because they all reached their historical time of death simultaneously, or because a great retainer who'd cultivated respect and prestige for years in civil affairs and on the field of battle was followed by his own loyal men to the afterlife in solidarity. I wasn't sure which, but either way, I really needed more guys. Like a lot more guys. This is more or less why I needed to invade all of Japan. I absorbed vassal states I vastly outstripped. I married Motochika to a princess for no other reason than because it seemed like a nice thing to do. I wanted to be fully stocked on officers, so I went back to Kyushu to finish the last remaining resistance. I finally toppled the impenetrable Otomo fortress, beating down Soren Otomo himself, who'd sat perched like a great immovable gargoyle since the earliest days of my campaign. Of course, due to our historical rivalry, gatekeeping me from Kyushu and all, he refused to join. And owing to his relative weakness, I chose to let him go. Before wrapping up and moving on, Motochika's 2 children, my 2 children, Morichika and Nobuchika, finally came of age and joined the clan. Unlike Motochika's arrival, the empire was so chaotic and so vast that they were unable to meaningfully distinguish themselves in Kyushu or even my next and greatest war. With everything in order, I slowly swept into Kinki from the east and the north, taking castles from various puny clans and bullying the craven Miyoshi. When their last bastion with any technical claim to Shikoku was mine, the game gave me the chance to end it right there. Technically, I'd started the game as Kunichika, so it made sense. His only real goal was the total unification of Shikoku, and anything else probably would invite destruction on an overly ambitious regime. But Nobunaga was so close. I've only spent this long harping on about Nobunaga. How could I ever pass up the chance to face him in battle? And at this point, the only real opposition between us was the remainder of the Miyoshi. Having forced them out of Shikoku and restricting them to Kinki, the Miyoshi acted as a light barrier separating my own empire and the rapidly expanding Oda clan. With death looming like a cloud of lethal rain over the spineless Miyoshi, I waited for the Oda to launch a full offensive and ordered my own attack. Pincered between two powerful empires, the feeble Miyoshi were meticulously scrubbed off the face of Japan. But I made sure to get the last castle, ensuring Hisahide Matsunaga joined my clan first. And the Saiki mercenaries as well. And the Honganji. Nobunaga had enough talent lining his roster. I started the game with an old-ass man, a barbarian, and some dudes. And now my giant army of dudes was supposed to topple the most infamous Japanese warlord and his elite death squad. During the Kyushu campaign, I made sure to start diplomatic relations with the Oda from a distance. When we finally met, or rather when we arrived in the same place, swords drawn and pointed at a common foe, we were already allies, so the Miyoshi were quickly routed, an ink smear in the annals of history. But just to be sure they didn't torch relations and stab me in the back, I married one of my officers to one of Nobunaga's sisters. Of course, this was all an incredibly clever ruse. Nobunaga historically fought dirty. He only beat the Imagawa under the cover of night and rain in a surprise attack. He outfitted his soldiers with Western guns and left other, more traditional daimyo to play catch-up. I didn't feel bad for torching the alliance and once again casting the shadow of doubt on Motochika Chosokabe, because I knew I was going to win it all back anyway. And I didn't stab Nobunaga in the back. I didn't wait for the cover of night. It's not even an option in this game, because if it were, I would have done it. So I tore our alliance to pieces, spit on the document, crushed it underfoot, and declared open war on the Oda. An enormous land war broke out as soldiers poured in from either side of the map. Officers rode in, only to find their numbers swiftly depleted by their swarming opponents, and for a time, it seemed like both sides were evenly matched. That is, until enough blood soaked the fields that the war's real players finally showed up and triggered a battle with Mitsuhide Akechi. This was mildly terrifying. Not only was Mitsuhide the eventual historical traitor to Nobunaga, the one who marched on Honnoji Castle, resulting in Nobunaga's death, but he was the first recognizable person I'd fought thus far. Desetsu Tachibana, Motonori Mori, some of the Shimazu, I knew these people more passively, names caught somewhere in the back of my mind, like Motochika, really, but largely uncrystallized. Mitsuhide is unforgettable, the way he's often represented as an ice-cold killer or a tragic hero or the most beautiful man alive. Regardless, I routed his forces and triggered authority. People knew me, and I'd garnered quite a bit of prestige, but so had Nobunaga, and he installed his own puppet shogun in Kinki. Because Nobunaga was so famous and his forces so great, the resulting authority burst gave me 4 castles in an instant, not from a main base siege, but a regular battle. I love authority for a lot of reasons, but also seeing the reactions of various daimyo, Nobunaga, the Takeda, Soren Otomo. Hold on. This motherfucker, you really got your ass beaten, Kyushu. I let you live, and you ran off to Nobunaga. This motherfucker. One victory alone wasn't nearly enough. Over 100 castles sat on that map. I controlled about a third of them by the time I rode against the Oda. But the Oda controlled a little less than a third themselves. Even if I had greater numbers, a lot of those men were landlocked in Kyushu. And remember, resources matter. Ignore time restraints. You cannot march an army on the west coast all the way to join a battle in central Japan. At least most of the time. That army will run out of supplies long before reaching their destination. Even in the best cases, most battalions only ever have enough supplies for 4 months, 120 days, and often less. Crops, resources, actually maintaining an empire becomes significantly more frustrating than sweating about who's got the best shot of winning any particular battle. Nobunaga's ambition is both an economic challenge as well as a military one. It's easy to recount the highlights because they're exciting, but the functional reality of play is 10 to 20 minutes of focus on economic stuff, managerial tasks punctuated by the occasional battle. And battles can stretch on for tens of minutes sometimes. Sieges can get pretty dragged out too. And with sufficient soldier counts, even regular battles can become exhausting. But they're also rare enough and exciting enough and high stakes enough that you're always locked in. But that same obsessive investment also extends to the busy work, which you might not expect. While you can pause the flow of time, time is a part of management. You need time to pass to actually accomplish any of your plans, your buildings, your diplomatic endeavors. So it can feel something kind of like Dragon Age Origins, stopping the action, making deliberate choices, and continuing, all while maintaining the same level of focus and strict control of the clock. Suppressing Kyushu wasn't just a waste, on that note. Even if those people could never meaningfully participate in battle, I could still transfer their officers to frontline castles and load my vanguard with stronger fighters. But this all becomes difficult to manage when battle is frequent, when castles are locked down or embroiled in combat already, when you're executing building plans. Even with control over the clock, time never turns backwards. The managerial aspect of play becomes something like Tetris, cold, efficient, slotting people in wherever you think they'll fit best to accomplish the goal you need finished now, and losing track of these things over time. It feels like I have never not worked too much. I used to work 40 hours in high school in grade 10 at a coffee shop. Jumping into my Korean teaching gig wasn't actually all that bizarre because I was used to working 9 hours, or at least having to set aside 9 hours of waking time, and unspoken labor abuses otherwise. By the time I was making YouTube videos and working on them every single day, and not like recording footage, I mean working on the material, it barely felt like a change of pace, except, that I actually enjoyed myself. I remember being so desperate, 6-ish years ago, to finally make it real. And so I dove in proper. But the scary thing is, even after all this time, vastly more stability, I haven't slowed down. I'm scared of stopping. Like, taking a break everything will come apart. I don't want to be a workaholic, but now that I think about it, I don't know if I've ever known any other way. I used to write poetry, and a lot of it focused on idyllic places, beautiful places, cliched, tired places. I think I was trying to create a vision of happiness, a place with no fear or worry, a place without constipation. And now that I think of it, I have no idea how I would function in such a place. The most interesting thing about this prolonged land war, something I started and prolonged with the Oda clan scrambling to muster defenses in response, was my chosen clan. Because I'd implemented unique Chosokabe policy which allowed my bases to repopulate faster than the Oda, I consistently found myself with a raw numerical advantage. My total officer quality wasn't very high. Even fielding some of the very greatest Shikoku, Kyushu, Chukoku, and Kinki ever produced, Oda's officers were legends by comparison. I needed the additional numbers to offset, distract, divert. I could send forces in multiple directions, at multiple castles, and that was all made possible because of my plucky nobody clan. Or at least, that's how I imagined them. Of course, not every clan has unique policies, and those will have an even harder time, but the fact is, you can use more than combat to get your way in Nobunaga's ambition. It's all about the talent, the ability to recognize it, and the willingness to use it. How many yo-yo trick masters laid down the yo at the altar of financial stability? Utterly humiliating. In my haste to clamp down on the Oda, I suffered multiple officer losses in combat, one of the daughters of the Shimazu, among others. People who really had no reason to die in battle except for my mad ambition. It's the kind of thing that makes sense in the moment. You're winning and it feels good, but what real reasons do you have for winning? Would Nobunaga's empire be worse? Was there a good reason we couldn't just split Japan among two unifiers? Of course, the goal of the game is total unification, but it now gives you multiple outs for this exact reason. It's an unlikely historical outcome, and That's why it's the subject of a video game. All this war for the love of the game. Maybe that's what ambition is. Maybe that's what dreams are. What ifs we can only ever make whole in mad pursuit with no real way of knowing if the goal will end up worthwhile. I would call Nobunaga's ambition a slightly existential experience. After prolonged regional bloodshed, I managed to defeat Mitsuhide a second time, which again handed me a number of castles. The war dragged on for some time, and I began to think Nobunaga wouldn't show. And then, in a sudden third battle, he appeared. It kind of jump-scared me. All this time, all these battles, and I'm finally face to face with the big man himself. I love the series' portrayal of the guy, especially through the years. Koshibasawa has stated previously that he wants to avoid representing Nobunaga Oda as some vicious, legendary demon king, and so he ends up portrayed more frequently as a rock-solid, forward-thinking general and a dreamer. Striking the Oda down isn't a matter of justice or toppling the evil empire, killing the final boss, but weighing two wills against each other in the cosmic balance. There's a significance underpinning any interaction the player has with Nobunaga. Can you actually win? Or will your dreams buckle under the godlike historical ripples he leaves in his wake? So when I won, really genuinely beat Nobunaga Oda in battle, I unleashed another sweeping authority burst that only emboldened me to press onward. There I was, previously entirely incapable of playing the game, at a basic level, now clashing with one of history's main characters. Because that's how it works. If you love something, if you really care about it and keep going, and keep improving and trying and pushing far beyond your naively conceived boundaries, building up and breaking down and building up that sandcastle again and again, eventually you find yourself there, right alongside everyone else who does these things. It only took so much mechanical consistency that by the time it happened, I already knew I belonged there. There was no sudden shock, it was almost expected. At this point, enemy clans of a much smaller size would entirely bend if I launched a full attack. Sometimes an enemy daimyo would simply negotiate to pick up and leave a castle, retaining one or two for themselves to get me off their back. But now, I was effectively unstoppable, except by the likes of Kanto's very greatest. The Oda, the Takeda, the Hojo, the Uesugi. They were peers instead of impossible rivals. The significance was only made more resonant by a series of crushing Oda defeats. Katsui Shibata floundered against my military prowess, by which I mean raw numbers. Oh, that's okay, buddy. You can't always win against impossible odds. That's statistically unlikely. Narimasa Sasa loomed fierce and deadly in the face of my completely regular people. I won every one of these battles. Not that they were easy. In some cases, I actually had to clench my teeth and make a series of tight maneuvers to entrap a stronger enemy between two of my units, and cut off their escape route with a third, something that becomes much more difficult in larger scale battles because your enemy may very well stock more total units, even if your numbers are technically greater, and they'll also have multiple deploy points. Multiple targets to take out can make battles a slog, especially against any particularly dangerous officer. History's most famous warriors who are much more likely to carve through your meat shields and run directly towards your own deployment point for an easy victory. By this point, I'm cutting directly through Oda clan territory, ignoring side castles that dot the broader map. They effectively surround me, but they're often left unable to march because I keep triggering authority, rendering all enemy marches in those affected areas impossible for a set time, long enough to build up my soldiers for the most part. I keep trying to cut the Oda clan off at the head, taking whichever castle is marked as the home base, but I find that they continually swap when it falls. I'm made to meticulously chew through their castles and cut them off wherever I can. The Oda were powerful, but their luck wasn't getting any better. I shouldn't have been surprised when I finally won a protracted siege at Gifu, Nobunaga's historical home base, and managed to acquire about half of his officers. I thought I was about to win completely, take Oda himself, but instead, he shifted his clan's headquarters once again, just as Gifu fell, transferring most of his strongest officers, Sasa, Shibata, etc., along with him. My push was so aggressive and my empire already so vast that before I could properly uproot the Oda clan, I'd already triggered the second end of the game. My son, Nobuchika, was fighting on the front lines, battering down castles and isolating Nobunaga's base from his other controlled territory. I realized I needed him alone, without options, to finally seal his fate. As I slashed and burned his empire to the ground, Kanbei Kuroda, one of Japan's most famous historical tacticians, won me the final fight against Mitsuhide, triggering another large burst of authority that secured the second ending before ever finishing the Oda. It's kind of surreal to sit on this screen with this man deciding the fate of the clan and all of Japan. Chikimasa Fukudome is not well chronicled in history, yet he was one of my most consistent allies, even when several of my Chosokabe clanmates, brothers, cousins, my own daimyo's father, died on the road to rule. Chikimasa was always there, even personally delivering a number of crippling blows to the Otomo. And Shimazu, he actually made it to an ending, something Kunichika never got the chance to do. It's the kind of screen that inspires you to get up and shout, where you'd normally hug your longtime friend in a moment of cathartic triumph. I understood then what Koshibasawa meant, getting so hyped up by his own game. Here, you're asked to choose one of 3 titles, and to close the game in the place of one of Japan's 3 great unifiers. While it doesn't actually matter which one you choose, they all end the game equally, and these titles didn't historically have the same level of political relevance. It's still an enormous accomplishment. Most clans could never actually rule this much land, maintain this much land, but Nobunaga did. And Hideyoshi carried the torch in Nobunaga's wake. And Ieyasu Tokugawa's rule stretched so far and lasted long enough to rival the previous shogunate. And for a while, I figured I was finished. I was having fun whooping Nobunaga's ass, but these battles weren't easy or quick, and there was a ton of micromanagement involved between them. Even if I did take out the Oda, I'd still have to contend with the swamp in Kanto. Like I feared of the Shimazu, Kanto's greatest powers ate up most of the small clans in the region and would be genuinely frustrating to weed out. But I'd come this far, and this was my only chance in playing any of the games to unify Japan. So I turned the shogunate down, who I effectively controlled. Like, I understand they didn't program in any means to become the shogun, even though I quite literally subsumed all of the Ashikaga shogunate into my empire, and therefore controlled the means to do so. But regardless, I ignored the disembodied shogunate and entered the final stages of the game. I fought for in-game decades to establish unimpeachable dominance for the Chosokabe clan. My greatest adversary in all this time was the Miyoshi clan, long erased from history. Nobunaga was scary, but after a few victories, I didn't feel particularly afraid of him. As I slowly vacuumed his lands into the gaping maw of my empire, I set siege to his home base multiple times, shunting him from castle to castle until the Takeda finally decided to get involved. This entire time, the Takeda avoided open conflict with the Oda because they were larger, but now, the Takeda had the chance to bully the significantly shrunken Oda in the mountains they called home. My plan was thrown into chaos. I wanted the chance to capture Nobunaga myself, and so, cutting directly into the mountains and squaring off with the Lord of Darkness himself, not with my son or my daimyo, but a completely average-looking person, I ended the Oda Empire for good. Nobunaga Oda and all of his best men were inducted into the Chosokabe clan. And then something happened. For the second time since starting this campaign, my daimyo, Motochika Chosokabe, died. Motochika didn't introduce me to Nobunaga's ambition, but he made it colorful. He burst into the world, painted the countryside with every action, and ran headlong into that blinding unknown. He's the first officer I came across with a unique combat ability. He felt cool. I became him. He became me. Would that I could live half as loudly in this lifetime. When Motochika died, a part of my playthrough died. Kunichika was one kind of loss, but Motochika molded the empire, and with his death, gaining control of Nobunaga, I felt that I'd finally done things right, or in a way that made sense, how they're supposed to be. Nobody lives to see the fruit of their highest aspirations, maybe a handful who ever lived. handful who ever had them, that is. Motochika passing, having mostly succeeded, and Nobunaga taking center stage, but this time on my side, felt comforting? Eternal, in a way. A blanket, a nod, a man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. Like he was acknowledging me for finally understanding his meaning. As though he'd remained independent all this time, just so he could join when the weight of my dream most needed carrying. Once again, I was asked to choose a successor. Unbeknownst to me, owing to my shaky history, I failed to realize that one of Motochika's sons canonically takes charge of the clan, but I ignored him because his stats were skewed. He couldn't cut it numerically, wasn't up to the task. At least in terms of politics, leadership, intelligence. His valor was high. He even had a unique combat ability. He was basically a main story player, but I went with Nobuchika instead because he seemed like the better pick. Handing off that much empire to one person, you gotta make the right choice. Your daimyo is also based in your clan's capital, and where the capital is positioned impacts play. Ideally, it's somewhere in the center of your empire so you can extend control over most of it in a web. That means the daimyo doesn't factor consistently into battles at this stage, this size, and often relies on newly conquered officers and transfers to do the heavy lifting in their stead, on the front lines. And he'd probably never have to fight the way Motochika, did to succeed. I immediately put Nobunaga's best officers to work as my vanguard. I decided to press into Greater Kanto until it burst like a zit. It wasn't going to be a matter of can as much as a matter of time. While the Takeda fell pretty rapidly in a series of swingy battles, and the Uesugi as well, who'd been tearing at each other's throats so long they were already long depleted, their ambitions crumbled, the Hojo posed a bigger problem because they're a highly defense-oriented clan. They had a greater investment in castle infrastructure and a pretty firm grip on the southeast, and so uprooting them seemed initially impossible. They didn't budge in the face of subversive tactics. Many of their most important castles were manned by officers who could resist my schemes. I sighed. It'd have to go the hard way. But I really didn't understand just how powerful Nobunaga was. I sent my combined forces, led by Nobunaga himself, directly through Hojo territory, slicing into and out of occupied land and openly ignoring established castles explicitly to demolish the Hojo clan's home base. And to my shock, it worked. The enemy AI acted defensively and rose to intercept, but only at my initial target. I was free to move through their lands unimpeded. While they looked powerful, my overqualified and well-chronicled officers, wreathed with the laurels of many battles, laid waste to the Hojo army in a decisive fight. And when my risky siege worked, they again shuffled their home base, their best officers, and I snatched up a few castles for free. And this basic flow of launching completely absurd attacks deep into enemy territory and ripping out their local influence by the root completely destabilized the game in my favor. There was no coalition to stop me. There were no worthy opponents. The only things that truly hampered my ability to succeed were managerial tasks, just like in the Chigoku region, now a faded memory. I was constantly acquiring and hiring and placing officers in newly captured castles explicitly to have a body to manage the area in my place. I entirely forgot about Kyushu, about Shikoku, about Chugoku and Kinki. There was no real reason to look back at where I'd come from because those lands were in others' hands and nobody was revolting. This is the root of the idealism underpinning Nobunaga's ambition. In reality, any empire handed off to someone unwilling to pay attention to every detail foments corruption and idleness. I felt the burden of leadership, never being able to be enough, never being able to spare enough attention. I was there as a teacher. People like to say teachers have favorites, and maybe they do, but you find that, really, you have to take on a whole lot of information at once, all of the time. Verbal, visual, people constantly attracting your attention while the quiet kids, the people who do nothing wrong, go ignored. Because no one person can stay attentive to everything without short-circuiting. You let people down a lot like that, but I think we'd all understand each other a little better if we actually looked for context instead of assuming. The biggest managerial issue is death. As seasons change and years turn, officers die. and you find yourself scrambling at all times to fill every empty slot, and eventually you can't. You can't fill every bucket. You can't possibly maintain the level of attention necessary, nor the raw human talent.
I see we're outsourcing labor.
People take time to educate. People are always in motion. Nothing lasts forever. And I understood, in a much more profound way, what that quote meant. A man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. I barely knew these people. The people dying now were men, officers I'd picked up in Kinki, and even later on. I didn't have fond memories of them. I didn't have a bond with them. Those days were long gone, when the Empire was smaller and the battles more fierce, riskier. These men left, and it was like they were never there. In the final days of the Chosokabe Campaign, I convincingly destroyed every major clan to ever vie for unification of Japan. At one point, I rolled into battle against Masamune Date himself, and he lost. To this guy. Masamune Date lost to this guy. The campaign's withering conclusion only illustrated how small and fragile any single person is. No matter the stories, no matter the legacy, all of it can come to ruin in an instant. The games have a penchant for showing Mitsuhide haunted for his betrayal. I like to think that Yoshimoto haunted Nobunaga in his final moments as well. Just the way Mitsuhide finds himself dead in the streets of some backwater village, a famed warrior slain by peasants. There is no glory in death without someone to write it later. And how well can you rely on other people to tell your story? When Dracula asked, "What is a man?" and answered with, "A miserable little pile of secrets," he was closer to the truth than maybe anyone else in video games. Secrets, yes, but so much ephemera as well. Stories, interpretations, anecdotes, and first-hand accounts, reputation, actions, perception, very little of the stuff that actually makes up a human being. Wispy tendrils in the form of a person pulled from the abstract. These battles were nothing like they were in the early days, back in Lonely Shikoku. With victory almost certainly assured in every single instance, they lacked the drama, the stakes. I had no fear, and I'd become so dull, so immune to loss that even Nobunaga's passing, of age or illness or whatever excuse the game had, his story was rewritten so the game sorted his fate out internally. His passing was exactly how he famously described, like a dream. Eras and eras of warriors, people who put their lives on the line for fame and money and status, land, safety, power, all passing under the lazy, drifting sky. Finally, in 1607, 61 years from the beginning of the game, the Chosokabe ruled the whole of Japan. Awakening has 3 total endings: conquering your starting region, which is relatively new for the series, taking half of the castles on the map and effectively recreating history, also relatively new, or seizing the entirety of Japan and creating a lasting peace. None of these endings arrive with much fanfare. Even in the oldest games, you're not exactly expected to roll credits, going by the minimalism of the series endings. And if you really are expected to win, they really don't do a good job of congratulating you, except maybe in the total unification ending of modern games, and especially Awakening, which is all very happily ever after. You did it. You altered history. And since you're the victor and history is written by the victors, maybe we're only given an ending this sickly sweet because that's exactly what any person who pushed this far and fought this long would expect, would believe of their own legacy. Even though so many of my castles were suffering from disrepair, long forgotten in the extended campaign to finally control Japan, completing the game, doing the impossible, feels incredible. It also feels shallow in a way I suspect the older games didn't. Here, in this new age take on Nobunaga's ambition, the game's designers gently pat you on the head and say, "Your empire established a lasting peace." I can handle optimism, but I draw the line at being lied to. Nothing lasts forever. Life is impermanence, and we were far too military. Thing would have imploded in 50 years tops. Looking back, there's a version of the game where the Chosokabe never conquered Japan, never beat the Oda. never even survived Shikoku or the Miyoshi. There's a version of this campaign where I quit, like I did so many times before. If I gave in at any point to old impulses and decided the ambition wasn't worth it. There's only one real version of history where the Chosokabe failed to consolidate power, served various lords from the Ichijo to the Miyoshi, and eventually Nobunaga, fought in the Siege of Osaka and were disbanded, their daimyo, Morichika Chosokabe, executed in 1615. From the records we have, this is the unshakable truth of the clan. There's also a version of your life where you never lost that loved one so young, didn't have that relationship fall apart, didn't land that important job. There's a version of your life where you're exactly what you believe yourself to be, where you accomplished all of your goals and where nobody stabs you in the back or limits your success. But you are not settled history, not as long as you breathe, as long as you embrace impermanence. If you've got anything resembling luck on your side, you'll probably last at least 50 years after you're old enough for a little Nobunaga's ambition and beer. Maybe you won't lead great armies or carve your name into a history book, but you've got time to live well, protect others, create things, accomplish dreams, to live true to your ambitions. When I first became a high school teacher, I unintentionally set myself up for failure by walking into a school I was already well known at, my own high school. This building was one of my favorite places. All my friends went there. I met my first and last girlfriend there. So many years before, I didn't completely hate school and I did okay. Because I also worked a full-time job on top of school for exactly 1.5 years, it was, at least, my second favorite place to be, at least among the places I routinely visited. I got some early jobs at that school because, presumably, the vice principal and person in charge of phoning in substitutes knew my mother, who'd spent 30-some years as a music teacher, someone who rose to the head of the department, the band leader, someone who chaperoned trips and taught generations of students, someone who was deeply loved even if she was criticized by some. She represented the old school, in a way, before things turned properly modern. She was the type to hop on stage during a pep rally and march to the school anthem, hyping students up and carrying the energy all on her own. She was a force. And that's how the teachers remembered her. It was a different culture by the time I arrived. That school, worn down and henpecked by its South End reputation, that is, low-class reputation, lost enough students over time that it eventually merged with another public high school in a similar situation. Some of the folks who taught me were still kicking. Some left, moved up, or retired in the 7 or so years since I'd last been a student. I knew, even then, that I wasn't good enough to make this a full-time job, so I handled substitute gigs, never really pushing my career, though multiple opportunities, in extremely large quotation marks, fell in my lap for the first year. And teaching is hard. It's so much different than you'd expect, especially if you were, actually a good student. But that's true of anything. Any kind of expertise and deeper knowledge of any single thing is misery gained. When I realized how challenging it could be and how it affected me, I like to imagine I felt something like Morichika did, trying to rise to the exacting standards of his father, the Chosokabe legacy. But if I'm honest, I think I probably felt more like Nobuchika, at least the version of him in my own campaign, inheriting so much in terms of legacy and totally unable to reach that lofty standard. Because even if I could, it was all the last gasping echoes of a bygone era. That time, my mother's time, was gone. I didn't inherit her fire, not for teaching anyway. Whatever I amounted to would be lesser. She was made for that role, the way she carried it, and I was a pretender. Awakening sat with me for a while. Every hour I played it sparked some memory or reflection. The thing just kept talking. This game I first thought of as nothing but a boring history simulator was speaking in ways that defied my understanding of the medium. You can't ever count on experiencing what other people do. Recommendations don't count for much in art, but in a year where a game had to explicitly state that art is a window and a mirror and that great art is both, here sat both. None of it was clip-worthy. None of it counted as spectacle, and all I wanted was another run. Realistically speaking, I don't have time to spend an entire spring and summer playing Nobunaga's Ambition. I work every day towards achieving something resembling a dream. I am, unfortunately, for the people around me and everyone online, infected with terrible purpose. I could play Nobunaga's Ambition every day. The exact minute I finished the Chosokabe campaign, I started thinking about doing another. I knew I shouldn't because, for someone who works way too hard and way too much, more footage is just more time spent. That sunk time could be another video. It could be 2, depending on how many evenings I burn. It's just that the game is really fun, and while I tried to get back to work handling other material, I found myself consistently thinking about Nobunaga's Ambition. When I showered, when I bought groceries, I won't start another campaign. I can't afford to start another campaign. I absolutely do not have the time to start another campaign. And that's how they get you. That Chosokabe campaign was glorious and made me a lifetime fan of the series, but some of my pretenses were false. The Chosokabe clan was not a nobody clan. They famously consolidated power in Shikoku and ruled over the region during the height of Nobunaga Oda's power by allying themselves with his clan. I only figured they were nobodies because they started with a single castle and I didn't actually know Japanese history. Sure, I'd played through a few weak approximations and seen documentaries and things, but the names and places slipped around in my brain space with no solid study to stamp them down. And mechanically speaking, starting as the Chosokabe is easier than probably most of the single castle clans. You have a few half-decent officers and more opportunity to expand because of the numerous other similarly tiny, non-threatening clans surrounding you. Your biggest threat, despite their despicable and untrustworthy nature, can be reasoned with. I wanted something completely different for my second campaign. I wanted a challenge. This meant looking for a clan that wasn't safe, or nestled away on a remote island, a clan that was known, but not necessarily powerful. After all, picking from among the most prominent clans, the Takeda, the Hojo, and the Uesugi, is the closest thing to a universal easy mode in any of these games. Picking the small but incredibly talent-packed Oda or Tokugawa would cause the narrative to side with me naturally, even turning off historical events, sheerly through the raw concentration of talent bursting from those clans. In Awakening specifically, you will face larger enemies with your turbo-powered kill squad and trigger enormous authority explosions, resulting in an exciting snowball-like run, but less likely to create challenge than you might expect. It's like playing as the Chosen One, and I may be one, but I definitely was not chosen. Rifling through the various clans, I suddenly remembered the shogunate. The Ashikaga shogunate, sometimes called the Muromachi shogunate, the bicentennial dynasty that defined the Muromachi period from 1336 to 1573, was the dominant military and political power in feudal Japan that partially collapsed halfway through said period, and was officially dismantled by Nobunaga himself when he aided and subsequently drove his own puppet shogun from office for failing to act as instructed. 30 years later, Ieyasu Tokugawa would found the Tokugawa shogunate in its place, in the wake of the Sengoku period strife, which would last for 250-odd years. The Ashikaga were not historical winners. As we know, Nobunaga's Ambition features historical events, things that should probably be left on as they're part of the experience, but they're left controllable for the sake of creating what-if scenarios. They can cause sudden upheaval and distress, and yet simulating history accurately as the game can manage. I don't think having 99 valor actually makes you stronger in real life. That accuracy can be exciting. For example, in 1583, Nobunaga is betrayed by Mitsuhide at Hanoji and dies, leaving the clan shattered into 4 distinct factions, forcing the player to choose which of the 4 to continue as if they're playing as the Oda. While it could be frustrating to watch your empire explode, especially for an ignorant player, it's also relatively true to history. Hideyoshi rushed to aid Nobunaga, arriving in time to stave off Mitsuhide's bid for power. Factions formed. The cards fell. But the Ashikaga shogunate has no such twisting, memorable story. Your daimyo, Yoshiharu Ashikaga, is deposed within the first 2 years of play through an event, just kicked out of his spot, naturally by the scheming Miyoshi. This is actually a mechanical blessing, as you're rapidly handed Yoshiteru Ashikaga, your new daimyo, who was apparently called the Kengo Shogun, which, using these specific characters, means swordsman shogun. He was known for his swordplay and his strength of character, the kind of person who might make turning the tables exciting. Historically, Yoshiteru Ashikaga took his own life when Kyoto was invaded by one of the Miyoshi clan's senior retainers, Hisahide Matsunaga himself. That's right, the tongue guy. With historical events turned on, played straight, the Ashikaga clan will suffer the loss of a whole castle blisteringly early, one of your 3, leaving you vulnerable to attack by other regional powers and inflating the power of the Hosokawa clan. Even worse, the clock on your most effective officer's life, your daimyo, Yoshiteru Ashikaga, is ticking from the moment he takes the reins. Thanks to the Miyoshi, of course, and a particular historical event. You are doomed by the narrative, doomed by history, an old clan from a dying breed encroached on from every border. Food for the jackals. You have to rewrite reality to survive. Save scumming is effectively the only way to play Nobunaga's ambition without tearing your hair out. While you can decide not to, you can also decide not to ride a motorcycle with a helmet because it looks cooler. You can also decide not to slam that 5th pint even though it looks really good. You can make better choices, even if protecting yourself means disappointing people. Very early in my high school teaching career, the second semester, actually, I was offered an LTO contract, a long-term occasional contract, higher pay after a number of days worked. They're usually offered to substitutes to fill in for a teacher on a leave of absence, pregnancy, that kind of thing, and they're a necessary stepping stone to a full-time contract for most people. It was actually my second LTO. I'd worked another in the first semester, but this one promised to be more substantial, last longer, and I was terrified. The course load involved 2 classes of grade 10 applied English, as opposed to the more university-minded academic English and a grade 11 college English class. I was also offered this job by my main contact at the school, a person who taught both of my brothers and worked with my mother, who wanted to help me get in, as it were. I was told by so many people at so many different times, you just have to say yes. And more afraid of letting my mother down and my other advice givers down, more afraid of being a lame duck than a failure, I accepted the position, even though I knew I didn't have the ability. I knew all through my gig in South Korea, I just kept hoping things would be different this time. Applied students would mostly rather chew glass than learn English, and while the 11th graders weren't awful, and one of the grade 10 classes wasn't entirely awful, just completely fed up with school by that time of day, the morning grade 10 class was excruciating. They hated me. They hated each other. Several of them had already made enemies in the class. It was a couple months till the end of the year. They felt genuinely unteachable. I never encountered such a spiteful, mean-spirited classroom from South Korea to Canada, and I never felt more useless in my life. And those students, I reiterate, did not like me. I am not a socially dominant personality. I understand the principles of leadership, but I struggle at a mental level with people who act in ways they shouldn't, routinely, in ways that make both their own lives and the lives of others more challenging. I was often called too nice by faculty and students, and I consistently failed to teach these students. I wasn't good enough. It was reiterated to me by admin and communicated through behaviors that what those students actually needed was a loud, no-nonsense stickler, and I did not have the chops. I mean, look at me now. I looked like them, dude. The teacher, in for the long haul and a prolific drinker, effectively vanished from the school with minimal contact. They shoved me into the hole he left because they needed a body that could keep the class pinned down. Originally, the LTO was sold to me as a couple of weeks, but as the job dragged on, the length extended. I'd be handling them for a month, then another, then till the end of the year. No reason given, the guy just wasn't coming back. Great money, by the way, really can't complain about the money for what little it's worth, but the cost was, of course, being forced to pick up the pieces of a teacher who left mid-semester. He almost cut contact completely, but I was informed that instead of having to create all of my own teaching materials from scratch, that he probably left some in the room. This was a few weeks in, of course, after I was already making them. I was also working 2 jobs at the time. Before this moment, sometime in April, I'd been working in after-school care for elementary students. Basically, if I got a call from high school for a substitute job, I'd take it. Generally around 5 in the morning, I'd go, work through the day, and drive off to my after-school gig to make a little more and pad out my resume. I was committed. Eventually, I needed to stop working with the daycare altogether because the workload became too much to bear. I was working the worst job of my life in those 3 classrooms and returning home to make up all the materials, the things the teacher I was covering should have provided. Naturally, he left no course plan, nothing resembling a roadmap, and a pile of fairly terrible worksheets. Busy work, to be clear, all jumbled up in a cabinet in the back. A few other teachers offered something resembling help with a basic set of directions and a few additional worksheets, but nowhere near what I needed for what I was teaching. I was, at a fresh 27, asked to create all of the materials, start a new roadmap, and learn how to handle one of the roughest classes in town, certainly the worst I had and have ever encountered. This brief couple months became my worst professional experience. It's the reason I eventually quit teaching some 2 years later, and it's the reason I haven't talked about any of this with almost anyone. I couldn't handle the shame. And the thing is, I knew it couldn't work, but I tried my best anyway, because I couldn't fail my mother. I should have turned that job down, but I'd at least pulled through all the other bullshit I put up with to get here, so why not coin flip on my future and fight the impossible fight? No matter how impossible the scenario, I wanted to use the Ashikaga playthrough to do things right. The Ashikaga clan have one bonus very few clans can claim, an enormous pile of gold. As the reigning power, even if it's more in terms of prestige than anything substantial, you have access to more money than anyone else to start, and to be clear, having multiple castles and strong officers is significantly more valuable than money in this game. Contrary to what you'd think, money can't buy land. Money can't reliably buy quality officers. Money will take the pressure off having to carefully manage your economy and let you afford diplomacy early, and these are critical because without diplomacy, you'd be wiped off the map in a single year. Hyenas surround you and they're drooling long before your first castle falls. Even still, officers are everything in this game. They handle construction, they handle whatever task you give them, but they can never handle more than one task at once. Meaning if you're rubbing shoulders with multiple clans, sucking up precious labor time with diplomacy, that's just as many missed opportunities to build, plot, do anything substantial. Playing as the Ashikaga clan poses an interesting challenge and a unique management problem. And while Yoshiteru himself enables a unique policy that lets you field larger armies, diplomacy becomes the default mode of play, at least in the early game. Imagine having to act like a respectable person in a society. What a nightmare. I used to have long hair, and whenever the principal passed me in the hallway, this red-faced, uptight type of person who would vote to expand the local police budget, for example, I'd always instinctively say, yo, as though I definitely had a future in education. The main feature of the Ashikaga playthrough is their shogunate status. They control the imperial court. They write those rules. And despite their relative lack of power, samurai kin groups, clans, regard that institution with some degree of respect in-game. You're able to distribute titles, ranks in the imperial court to enemy daimyo, to your enemies, which can make truces and other forms of negotiations easier. Doing so also buffs whichever clan's prestige, and that can be a problem in some cases, but it's part of the fun. Money also lets you buy treasures more frequently to keep officers happy, but it's also worth noting that your starting gold mountain, enough to mock God, by the way, will eventually exhaust itself as you rapidly scramble to build up and branch out, and you'll need an actual economy at some point. It's not a limitless resource, just easier access to options. To illustrate the relative worthlessness of gold, I replayed the opening years a few times before realizing that no matter what I did, whether I was aggressive or docile, The neighboring Rokkaku clan would eventually sweep in from the east and crush me completely. I didn't understand what was happening and figured it was some kind of historical turnabout, because you begin the Ashikaga campaign with the Rokkaku as friends. Not every clan has the advantage of good standing with others, but I figured they'd help level the playing field after starting on the back foot. But there they were, storming my castles and razing my fields. They were the friend I never had as the Chosokabe. They were just another enemy. I was reminded of the bitter truth that you truly cannot rely on any single person, even people who would otherwise claim to be your ally, because every individual person has beliefs, goals, and motivations that supersede your own. I sat with this a while, the scenario and the mild existential crisis it spawned. No matter what I did, the Rokkaku would eventually cut my empire to ribbons. So I reset the campaign, and this time I prepared for the exact moment I'd lose my castle, and swiped it back in response. I pursued an early Rokkaku alliance. I specifically ensured that our diplomatic relationship was firmly established and clearly delineated. Whether the Rokkaku turning was my own mistake or some unforeseeable complication, it never happened again, and I continued like normal. They couldn't betray me anymore because I deliberately got friendly. That's how it works, right? During that very same teaching contract, the really bad one, I made a point of reaching out to the other English teacher across the hall, my own 11th grade English teacher from some 10 years earlier. I remember being instructed by the admin to ask her for help, and so I did. I got a few worksheets, even though she really didn't teach those classes anymore. Grade 10 applied English, I mean. As the department head, she got the choice to hand off certain classes to others and had no long-term interest in sticking with English. Found it unrewarding. Went for drama, last I heard. I made a point of trying to befriend her because she was the closest thing I had to a familiar face in that department. While another teacher I recognized still worked there, I never found myself in his class, so we had no previous connection. And while I covered for yet another teacher's classes previously, I didn't have any real kind of relationship with that person beyond the strict working sense. I figured my 11th grade English teacher was a worthwhile person to rely on, so I did. To a point. She also criticized me for being too nice. I remember the exact phrase she used being, doing this whole Zen thing. I don't think I do a whole Zen thing. And she helped me with exam prep. She had ideas about the course roadmap and said she'd work with the admin to get me support for a handful of students who were particularly out of control. Everything about that job felt impossible. The planning, the execution, the classes, and I was getting used to the feeling. I'd worked in LTO previously, and while I didn't have an amazing time in that one, I managed, okay? I wasn't completely useless. I could wrangle my South Korean students well enough, and the after-school kids just fine, even if I threw my neck out once running with them. And by the way, that first LTO was an Ojibwe class. For the most of you who don't know what that is, I was tasked with stepping into the role of a teacher who taught a Canadian First Nations language. I do not speak Ojibwe. In truth, they wanted anybody, and I do mean anybody, to sit at the desk and act like a teacher, reviewing the course material and delivering the exam. It lasted, I want to say 3 weeks, maybe 4. This was my first long-term occasional contract, a big deal for your third month substituting, but I was immediately offended by the premise. I did not belong there. They had a guy who worked on the reservation about 15 minutes away, but he wasn't qualified to teach high school classes. So, though he was a more suitable candidate because he could speak the language, and many parents on that reservation would have been fine on that note, they weren't allowed to stand in that room, in that capacity. And the worst part was, I had to rely on an actual Ojibwe speaker with a job at the school who couldn't leave his position. He looked at me, and I looked at him, older, more tired, and we both silently accepted that privilege was real and it was making me money I didn't deserve. That class set the tone for my high school experience. Some friendships, alliances I guess, are born out of necessity. Of course, staving off the Rokkaku was not the end of my problems. While I'd successfully created a version of history where I instantly repelled the Hosokawa clan, installed after Yoshiharu was deposed, storming the castle and taking back my property, and even managed to push north into a smaller clan to quickly snatch up the means to produce more soldiers and therefore better defense, I found myself staring down my old Chosokabe Campaign nemesis, the Miyoshi. Anytime I dared to take a castle beyond those two I just mentioned, the Miyoshi would suddenly spring to action and thunder in from the coast to tear me apart. I had no real defense against their armies. My officers were limited, both in number and ability, and I simply couldn't match the combined strength of their best officers. Nobunaga's ambition is interesting because whatever you're dealing with, everybody else is dealing with too. If the Takeda are harassing you, they're definitely harassing other clans in your area. You hate them. I hate them. If you pick Takeda, you're probably going to hell. Since the beginning of my journey with Nobunaga's ambition, I was amazed at the way a simple simulation game with minimalist presentation cast in a haze of dry numbers consistently managed to inspire the formation of parasocial relationships with vaguely historical approximations of Japanese samurai kin groups. I genuinely hated the Miyoshi. I don't care whether the history books have painted them as noble. I don't care if they could turn water into wine and walk on water. To me, the Miyoshi were a sickness in both of my completed runs of Nobunaga's ambition, and I will never look at them as anything more than gangsters and outlaws, brigands, thieves, and ruffians, roughnecks, bandits, and thugs, absolute villains, utter criminals, highwaymen, malefactors, scoundrels, desperados, and goons. Whatever I did, they'd respond. Whoever I targeted, they'd leap to punish, or just about. Anyway, by methodically making save files and targeting different enemy clans, I discovered I could make trickling progress and not invite immediate destruction. The Miyoshi did not react to every clan being targeted, only most of them. It wasn't strategic, it was brute force, because brute force seemed like the only thing that could solve my forever feud with the Miyoshi. I just wish brute force, trying and failing until you eventually reach an acceptable outcome, didn't also cost time in the real world. I mean, how many of us have made one wrong choice, even a tiny one, a feeling, a whim, that irreparably altered our life's course? I think you probably haven't lived long enough if that isn't instantly true. And when these choices, sudden or otherwise, do change our lives, they become settled history. There is no second take. Failure implies finality, pass or fail. Instead of release, death, we're made to live on regardless. In this way, a person becomes a failure, cursed with that word and made to bear its weight. The way we're taught, the way we're graded in binary terms, pass or fail, it's impossible to escape the many specters of our own dead selves, better selves, the ones deemed worthy, successful. Most of us, I think, live with that weight, the promise of every one of us that could have been. What haunts me, even today, about that one high school job, that one LTO, was the way students reacted to me. I learned a lot about being disliked in South Korea. Nobody likes the French teacher in Canada, so why should anyone like the English teacher in South Korean Hakwons or private schools? In some cases, you're basically there to torture those kids. Some of them, the elementary kids, blow in after a full day at school with 2 more Hakwons lined up after yours, 9 to 9. And most of the other kids were young. Like, we're talking as young as 5 in one case. I was teaching English to children at a time when they hadn't yet mastered their own language. It felt odd, though I understand it's fairly common in many parts of the world. And I'd run into the occasional kid who just hated me. I didn't yell or treat them with any kind of disrespect. Not that I was aware of, anyway, but occasionally one would form some kind of negative bond with me, and that was that. It was rare. A lot of kids aren't malicious, only bored. And you're the subject of their torment. I knew what being disliked was like, and that it was common. But those were Korean kids. I thought, often, if I could only speak to these few antagonistic children, if we could actually communicate, it'd work itself out. In those high school classes, I realized pretty quickly that teenagers are ruthless and direct and cruel, and often for no good reason. I showed up every day at the same time and did my job. I was not late. I came to class prepared with the material I took the time to prepare in lieu of any real help on the part of the admin. English department and previous teacher, and unlike him, I didn't leave. I tried to make the material fun. It's just I constantly had to put out fires, as it were. I didn't take sick days or mental health days because I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to do the job. I didn't abandon them partway through or cast them off. I put up with a lot. Like I said, I was often criticized for being too nice, but the response from a few students was abject cruelty. I remember a student who stormed out of my class after calling me a joke over something like asking them to turn in an assignment, maybe. I remember a student who genuinely seemed to despise me for being direct and clear that I didn't want slurs used in the classroom. I have to reiterate, I don't like being cruel to anyone, and especially kids. Most of them are entirely blameless. The raw enmity you can foment in a student for acting like any other teacher might, but a little softer, would astound you. And it wasn't every student, but among the few who did react badly, I realized even talking wasn't enough. I just wasn't the person for those people. And that happens. I'd seen it happen before. I saw it happen with my mother. It's part of life, part of the job. Every teacher goes through it. But without a list of things to correct, without any real bridge to solve these problems, I felt increasingly like I'd done something terribly wrong. All I wanted to do was hold things together, and I somehow couldn't even do that much. And you learn a lot about people, like human beings, as a species when you teach. Sometimes people ask things like, why did countries go to war? Why would samurai groups kill each other? And really, you can learn everything you need to know about human beings in a classroom with a rejected authority figure. Every action is scrutinized, every sentence is inspected, every move is a power struggle. You watch people try to push their own boundaries, try to exert their power just for the sake of doing it. Old people think younger generations are doomed. I happen to think the young people I met are very well prepped for the real world. The best feedback I got came from students who were bullied or felt out of place. More or less only entered the applied classes because they struggled academically, and not even then. One of them easily could have handled the academic stream and maybe didn't see the point. They made sense to me because they weren't malicious people. They didn't act in ways that would only make their lives and the lives of others harder. Maybe they were just more privileged. To be clear, I regret struggling with the tougher students. I blame myself. Every student who enters public education deserves the care and attention the profession demands. It is your job. Some teachers will tell you that it's about reaching that one student, and they say it in this henpecked way, like they've been working their entire lives in this thankless job while students call them worthless, and parents scream at them because my kid says you hate them, and right-wing pundits for some reason think you're infecting the children with gay. And I think I relied on that advice too much. I knew that I was myself. I knew it when I first started my practice teaching during Teachers College, and I knew it in South Korea. I knew it during daycare. I struggled really connecting with kids, and the best trait I had was being there, which is a little bit useful. Very little, turns out. Admin wanted me to be a firm disciplinarian, and I hadn't developed those muscles yet, muscles that I don't know if I'll ever develop. I was young. I was idealistic and naive, and I believed softness was better than being a hard-ass because the only teacher I ever hated was a hard-ass. Hard-asses only ever made my life harder, but that's what admin wanted, that's what my 11th grade teacher wanted, and that's what the students made apparent they wanted. Every time I ever lost my patience with a student or raised my voice or stood in open conflict, I felt sick, ill. And for days after, it haunted me. It lingered. It wasn't the school experience I knew. It wasn't the decent time I had. Every day was some new thing to be miserable about. I wanted to blame myself and did. But I remembered that both of the teachers I'd covered for left from sheer stress. People who were far more experienced than myself. Why did they put me in those classrooms? It feels like a sick joke. Intentionally cruel. Other teachers were just as easygoing as I was. I just happened to be young and stupid. They just threw me in to the wolves with no meaningful support, decided this was a pass or fail moment for me. No plan, no material, told me to make it work. If I failed, I was failing it. In a better world, in a world I belonged in, my Ashikaga clan extended control over mainland Kinki. This required making heavy use of diplomacy to pacify nearby clans, and when I grew strong enough, vassalizing the numerous smaller clans I called neighbors. Making a clan your vassal isn't always possible, and it isn't always convenient. A vassal is effectively an ally that you extort for resources with the flimsy promise of protection. You can't actually seize their lands without consuming them, which requires an officer with a specific ability, or by torching your good graces and lowering your honor, making neighboring clans perceive you as traitorous. And pal, I ain't no damn Miyoshi. Maintaining many vassals can hamper your expansion opportunities. It's better to conquer other clans outright. Unless 120,000 Miyoshi dogs are scrutinizing your every action, that early alliance with the Rokkaku was invaluable. I could call on them to help me capture frustrating targets, even head to battle with them at my side. It felt like I wasn't alone, even if I never properly forgave them for turning on me early. And your allies act completely independently. In one case, they were chewing through a clan, a historical ally and eventual enemy of the Oda, but the Rokkaku depleted themselves before they fully seized all of that clan's lands, leaving only the main base and all of its officers. Like a single juicy apple dangling low from a tree, I grabbed it instantly, took the castle in a short siege, and claimed all that talent, including the man who would father Nobunaga's own historical brother-in-law, Nagamasa Azai. It was a dirty play, but scheming for survival was my only option. Not everyone gets to be the best. Why do we have hands, if not to take matters into them? I made sure, through my vassals and my strategic castle seizures, to lay a web around all of the Miyoshi front in Kinki. If they ever started a land war, I'd be able to collapse on them from multiple points and hopefully wipe them out. I even targeted specific officers. The Ashikaga clan has limited opportunities for expansion early in the game and pretty minimal combat talent. They host a number of politicians and leaders, but few soldiers. So I looked around at neighboring clans until I came across an absolute beast of a man holed up in a neighboring castle. I specifically conquered that clan to take that particular officer, and it was worth the effort. Yeah, this game ain't just about winning combat. Strategy counts. This dude could take on anyone. Turns out he's kind of famous in the series, a historical warrior of the region, and despite lacking a modernized portrait and special abilities, he was my strongest fighter for most of my run. And still, I maintained a network of strategic alliances and pressured others into vassalizing. I was playing a profoundly political game in a way that completely reflavored the experience. In the Chosokabe Campaign, I absolutely made vassals out of smaller clans and formed alliances, but mostly with the Miyoshi to keep their disgusting hooked fingernails out of my back and to protect myself at vulnerable points while my attention was turned elsewhere. I felt like I was actually inhabiting the Ashikaga shogunate, and despite my daimyo's combat capabilities, winning more on the tactical front than the war front. Of course, that necessitated a lot of resets and saved games, a lot of bookmarks and dog-eared pages in the textbook, revising history until I got my perfect version. It's also why I now scowl in reflection thinking back on those early forum posts about assassination. That player, and me, uninitiated and lacking fuller context, genuinely believed that a game where you can simply order your problems killed qualified as sufficiently political. And it's absurd because while yes, assassination attempts are present in some versions of Nobunaga's ambition, I and that player were asking for a blanket license to kill, regardless of who the targets were, who they were connected to, what they stood for, who they protected, what it meant about me, us. I knew Nagayoshi Miyoshi for a fork-tongued devil, but I didn't want him to shuffle off for free. I wanted to take care of him myself, the fair way. Eventually, I'd built up enough strength in castle acquisitions and pilfered officers to prevent the Miyoshi from outwardly declaring war, even when they were previously provoked. This gave me a number of potential targets, but my greatest enemy was still out of reach. The Miyoshi dominated the coastline and had alliances with other small but talent-rich clans, so open conflict would be messy. And with my significantly higher prestige, a consequence of picking the most well-known name in the land, an enemy triggering authority, if I failed, would be devastating. I made another save file. I couldn't afford to make mistakes. I could not afford to fail. I have this memory of, after a month of failing to get a handle on my hardest class and needing more help than a teacher usually needs, of getting called to speak with the principal. We sat down, I waited, and he told me that he knew I was struggling but needed me to do better, and that my 11th grade English teacher, my ally and colleague, told him that she wouldn't recommend me for a position at the school, that she said I wasn't cut out for the job. I knew this already, I knew it from the beginning, but to hear it said aloud, to hear another professional earnestly telling me, and knowing my own teacher put the knife in my back so effortlessly. No, well, the teacher disappeared in the middle of the semester. No, well, these kids are really rough. No, yeah, good job with writing up so much material. No, yeah, we really dropped the ball on support, to be honest. No, I guess you're kind of new and there are mitigating factors. Just, you're garbage. You're useless. We don't want you here. They didn't fire me, of course, they couldn't. I was a union member and I hadn't technically done anything wrong. Except one of my students with a youth criminal record punched a locker because of his anger issues, and the kids were loud and particularly disruptive in one of the 3 classes, out of control. So I toughened up, yelled more, and felt miserable every fucking day. I couldn't look at that teacher the same way anymore. I didn't talk to the other teachers. I knew I was being spoken of. I knew I was being unfavorably compared to my mother. Everybody knew my mother. And everybody knew my career was a total wash. I didn't talk to anybody about it for months. I didn't tell my friends. I couldn't stomach that pain. I uploaded videos all throughout that time. A lot of them had surprisingly dark endings for otherwise obnoxious, angry reviewer schlock. I kept the job. Or my license, of course. I wasn't happy for most of that time. I slowly stopped working at that school. Daily gigs were too much embarrassment. How could I look at past students? I could hear the judgment in voices, the teachers, the office workers, even. And while I worked in other schools, and mostly worked in other schools, it was never consistent enough after that. The vibe never quite recovered. Years of feeling a disconnect to my chosen profession, a burning need to do anything else, regret like a tumor, draped in shame, and no idea where I was going, what I could do at all, anywhere. All because I took a job I knew would destroy me. Nobunaga's ambition dredged these memories out of me. Amidst so many stories of ringing triumph and bitter defeat, I saw myself on those fields. Another poor sap heading into the real world to get chewed up and spit out. Eventually, I got a cutscene of the Saito clan in the Oda, a young Nobunaga entering Nijo Palace at the heart of the shogunate to pay their respects to me. And through all this scheming, pulling threads taut and spinning the plates, winning open conflicts with the shogun's sword dance technique, I felt like I deserved it. It was a lot to hold together and always on the verge of collapse. If I lost too many officers from illness, if I stagnated, if a stronger military force like the Oda actually broke out and attacked me. But as it was, I was effectively role-playing the shogunate. I even managed to recruit, entirely through luck, the great historical warrior Sakon Shima, an officer with terrifying numerical strength. It was like stumbling onto a shiny Pokemon for the first time. Playing as the Chosokabe, I only ever felt compelled to spend precious labor points searching for officers early in the game, in the boonies, where you'd only find average to below average opportunists. Maybe I'd earned it somehow by actually accomplishing something. With a much stronger grasp of the mechanics, I realized I could increase my war machine's efficiency by fighting on 2 fronts. It's tempting to select an invasion point and let the game automatically send all of your available in-range armies to converge on that point, and it's a fine tactic. I did it all through my first campaign, but it's slower because it's wasteful. You don't need every army at one spot when you're juggling 15. You can divide them. And so I began my greatest war, the battle to decisively re-establish the shogunate. The targets were simple. I had to eliminate my 2 greatest threats, the Miyoshi and the Rokaku. The Oda clan would become a problem in time, as they are in every campaign, but left alone, the Miyoshi could easily expand to the rest of Shikoku, even Shugoku, given sufficient time. On the other side of the coin, the Rokaku were the 2nd strongest clan in the region. Because I backed them, they had as many enemies as the Miyoshi, minus me, and bordered the Saito and the Oda clans that were weaker at the time and if they played correctly, could have expanded to the east, snapping up even more terrifying officers than I had access to. Remember, I wasn't playing the Chosokabe anymore. My castles didn't repopulate soldiers quicker than other clans, and my total combat strength, regardless of numbers, was lacking. And I remembered how they turned on Yoshiharu, how they swept me off the map when I was so much smaller. The plan was risky, but keeping them as allies would have hindered my ability to expand east. Fighting them opened me to attack from any number of nearby opponents. I was actively splitting my army, but I was convinced I could win. Risky plays can pay off massively and decisively alter the game. And besides, I had my save files. So I launched the attack. First, I went after the Miyoshi because I had to. I mentioned a ticking time bomb. Historical events play out as long as a number of conditions are fulfilled. Left alone, these conditions will play out naturally. The AI will effectively attempt to recreate history. Nobunaga is always betrayed by Mitsuhide Akechi in 1582, and the Oda clan fractures. Yoshiharu Ashikaga is always deposed as the acting shogun in 1546. Similarly, Yoshiteru Ashikaga is always killed in 1565 when the Miyoshi overrun Nijo Palace on the order of Hisahide Matsunaga. You have no way to avoid this fate, with historical events turned on, unless you remove players from the stage of history entirely, or otherwise rewrite the timeline in some other way. I think it goes without saying that, with my comparisons to Motochika, Yoshiteru in this moment was also me. You need to seize the threads of fate with your own power. With Nagayoshi Miyoshi en route to die from illness in 1564, just as he did in the Chosokabe Campaign, I had to storm their fortified position, collapse from all sides to annihilate them before losing Yoshiteru. It's worth stating that Yoshiteru's death would not end the game. Instead, it would force me to choose from among the collected officers a successor, possibly the historical successor, the installed puppet shogun, Yoshiaki Ashikaga. But that in itself would be a spiritual defeat. Historically, Yoshiaki's reign ended with Nobunaga. Even entertaining that possibility felt like consigning myself to fate's course, and I had no intention of walking the pre-laid path. In a series of chaotic battles, confrontations that cost me officers through sudden battle deaths, I was able to reduce their controlled castles to a small handful. Eventually, I triggered an authority burst that shoved them all the way out of Kinki. This resounding blow reduced them to a single island fortress, where I once again took up my sword as the sword shogun himself and stared down the void, my would-be assassin. I barely managed to pull ahead of Hisahide's schemes in a brutal final siege, fighting uphill and against fate, and with my blade, white-knuckled and full of fury, painted the pages of history with his blood, obscured its solemn truth, and traced the first messy records of a new path forward. It's beautiful to me in a way that some people are simply destined to be enemies in every timeline. And that's okay. If we're fated to do battle, at least we're fated at all, been weighed in the cosmic balance and given some place to belong. During this coastal campaign, I was carving my way slowly around the Rikaku, taking all of Kinki otherwise, and with their sole clan remaining as the final resistance against my inarguable dominance, took our alliance in hand and scattered it to the four winds. Born Sadayori, Jotei Rokaku lived a long life for a Sengoku period warlord, a skilled archer, a devout Buddhist. He dedicated his life, even after conversion, to aiding and advancing his clan in increasingly turbulent times. Threatened by the Oda, resisting Nobunaga's invitation to join forces, and even being imprisoned by the man, later escaping and assisting in the resistance to Oda's grab for power, Jotei Rokaku lived a life worthy of legend. But I never forgot. I never forgot trying to establish myself and being beaten, robbed, discarded, and backstabbed. To me, what I was trying to accomplish, Jotei was one of my greatest enemies. He never overthrew Nobunaga. He saw fit to punch down on now the only person alive capable of rewriting history. He had to go. And he did. His story was beautiful, but it was written for another time, another world. And time, unbeknownst to Jotei, had already changed. I took every last thing he ever beheld. My high school, the first school I taught at, and the one I taught at most, closed its doors some 6 years ago now. It was an old building, very old. Students who died in World War II were memorialized on plaques. A handful of graduates from this small Ontario town who attended this exact school are recorded on Wikipedia. My mother taught there for the bulk of her working career and built a legacy that lingers still. People ask, how's your mother? She's still playing. Oh, I saw your mother the other day. She's still so fiery. The local paper, multiple Facebook groups, people I recognized were openly upset at the closure. This place was a home for so many people. The schools are always more than merely educational. They're communal. They're safe spaces. In some cases, there isn't food at home, and schools, at least where I live, will provide something for breakfast. That might be the only thing a kid eats all day. If you're a teacher, you might be the only kind person a student speaks to at all. And that particular school was once a place of joy, achievement, belonging, a place that made me feel like my future was going to be something. Until my 20s hit and I spent most of them entirely miserable. Even my mother, I'm sure, would rather the school be preserved. For her, it was also another home. But for me, all of my memories of that place were tainted, warped and blackened by experiences I genuinely don't wish on anybody. Failure, ego death is maybe the most important part of growing up. It's unavoidable. But at the level I had to experience it, the full weight of my worthlessness made plain, I could only pray the closure happened faster so that it might turn to history, so that I might forget. Even now, the building stands, converted into a series of generic healthcare businesses, or at least it was. Apparently, it's been converted into a private school, something I'd never properly seen in my hometown growing up, as shifts in Canadian education have created a quasi-space for flexible credit acquisition and remote learning. Of course, those teachers, those people, are all still working for the actual school. It simply moved into a now renovated version of the school that initially merged with the one I knew. People shuffle around, but it's all business as usual. Seasons turn. Time ticks on. I've been asked before, well, what if your YouTube career dies? Will you go back to teaching? You can always go back to teaching, but I don't know if I can. Maybe better to hack it in the trades or edit for someone or work general labor. Not that I'm in danger. The job's only gotten more viable as I've gone, but the question remains. I hate myself for failing, for spending so much time working towards something I didn't believe in. I hate myself for fumbling my mother's legacy. I couldn't talk to other teachers, not openly, not freely, for fear that they knew I had a rough time in my own school, and mentally put together that, well, that's his mother's school. That must have been embarrassing. How do you talk to someone who's probably filling in so much of your context on their own? Missing context to an outsider is an empty canvas, blank pages for writing stories. I did not want, could not allow anyone else to author my story. So I only had two choices: stay and stick it out, overwrite the bad with the new, push myself to the breaking point until I, maybe, inevitably dropped off the face of the earth like that vanished English teacher, stay no matter what happened, just like I had for so long, to my own detriment, or leave, and finally admit that maybe I could do something somewhere. 5 years full-time and counting. A man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. YouTube is not my highest aspiration. It's one of them. It's something almost nobody gets to do, at least at this level. I'm privileged with the opportunity to show off Nobunaga's ambition and have someone hear about it. Still, I want to be a writer as well, like the published kind. I want to paint, and I don't know if I'll ever get around to that. I want to make things that speak to people in more ways than solipsistic self-obsession. And I'm only 33 now, but the clock is ticking. And one day, I will die. Probably sooner than I'd like, leaving so many dreams, wishes, wants, scattered fragments of unfulfilled ambition in my wake. But fear, cowardice, complacency are far worse fates than disappointment for someone infected with terrible purpose. The Ashikaga's rise, my rise, was unstoppable and absolute. My most unassuming gestures rippled through history's weave, dislodging threads and fraying their ends just before my inevitable clash with Nobunaga Oda. Horses well en route, I befriended the Saito clan just to the north with diplomacy, something I'd been working on through this war. And the very second it happened, their daimyo died, as though I poisoned it myself, or his officers did in disgust for the alliance's sake, or through sheer mental fortitude I willed him to die. And this rendered the already weakened Saito irrelevant. Finally, I stood once again at the precipice of battle against the game's greatest opponent. He was young then, hardly the man he'd grow up to be, but that person already lived in the sunlight of history's pages. Remembered as ruthless or not, he was remembered. Maybe more than any other warlord, more than most people who've ever lived. After a three-castle authority burst, one with that very same officer I sought early to crush the Miyoshi, I realized Nobunaga was finished. I looked at the map, I sat, my own peerlessness reflected in the size of my empire, and I chose to end the game there. I'd been playing Nobunaga's ambition at peak efficiency, doing everything I could, fighting a war on two fronts at multiple points, and managing the empire in the meantime. I was precise, mechanical, and unbeatable. Like the Chosokabe in their final years, I didn't realize the game was well within my grasp until I took a moment to look around and realized I was finally safe. Actually safe. Yoshiteru would not be cut down in his prime, and the Oda had no real chance of stopping me or anyone. The other great clans languished as I rose explosively. It was checkmate well before I fought them, and I wanted to be there. I loved my time in that place, but I knew when it was time to move on, maybe to even greater challenges. But mostly, I was thankful the game gave me something I'd never have otherwise, a chance to fight fate. Sure, I had to aggressively abuse save states to craft a world that worked for me, but I got there. I still played through those other realities. I still died time and time again, so many times. But I persisted long enough until the bad luck ran out. I wonder if it's possible to exhaust bad luck, if anything is luck or if it's just an excuse. I've done so much extra work to hedge my bets against an unstable future, something that's paying off, but I may end up paying for in the future. And I tried to ride out this so-called bad luck in teaching as well. I took a third LTO before I left for good. It was in this school that took 20 minutes to drive to, out in the country a bit, and the gig was easier. I actually got to teach a couple of academic classes who were so decent, I hardly remember them. And it was doing all the things I loved in university, Shakespeare, teaching high school English the way it was taught to me. The job I thought I could do, and I was. It was fun. The teacher didn't vanish. They had a health issue that took a little longer than expected to resolve, but they contacted me, had a course plan, actually cared about their job and my place in it. And even though I didn't hate my time, I still saw myself reflected in those classes. I wasn't any better of a teacher, I just stumbled into an easier situation. I spoke to teachers frequently there and occasionally mentioned that I wasn't sure if I was going to stick around forever, which you really should never do. But these people weren't working against me. They had no designs of their own, to my knowledge, and I remember how many of them answered, well, things have changed. It's not like it was. I don't know how many years I have left in me. And for a moment, I felt seen. Everybody knows the job is hard. Thankless, even. Most jobs are. It's not that most people aren't cut out for teaching, it's that most people don't have a real reason to only end up there. Anyone who's unironically said, those who can't do, teach, haven't got a goddamn clue. Doing is so much easier than leading. I work every day. I am an actual certified workaholic. This is nothing compared to that. I have this memory, like a painting, so clear, of light filtering through the tall classroom windows at that last big job. End of the day, students gone, classroom barren, A janitor slowly moving from room to room down the hallway, that day's assignments in hand in a little binder, ready for grading, dust illuminated by the fading golden beams, thinking, I could die here. This might be it for me. Originally, I wanted to play Nobunaga's Ambition a third time through to round out my experience as fully as possible. This led me to picking the puny Murakami clan, who operated only 3 castles and had no real benefits, including no unique policies, and who bordered the Takeda. I tried so many combinations of moves to make this campaign work. I must have started it 20 times. I tried calling in my ally, a tiny neighboring clan, for defense when the Takeda inevitably mobilized to wipe me off the map, which accomplished nothing because the Takeda have many more castles, many more soldiers, and some of the strongest fighters in Kanto. I tried diplomacy with any number of other clans around me, including the Imagawa, the Hojo, and the Uesugi, but none of them were particularly interested, and the average political score on all of my officers couldn't advance the alliances fast enough to garner any kind of aid in time. The Takeda always attacked, and they always attacked me first, without fail. I couldn't even vassalize. The Takeda despised the Murakami out of the gate, and even doing something as sniveling and pathetic as handing over your land, even though the game indicated it would change their minds, never made a difference. I could reduce myself to a single vulnerable castle, and they still hated me. Maybe I could have become a vassal for the Uesugi, but with those reduced prospects and such strong opponents, it felt pointless. How could I ever spin up a dream if I dashed any hope of real momentum early on? Yoshikyo Murakami is mechanically designed to battle with Harunobu Takeda, the man who would eventually change his name to Shingen Takeda. He has a unique combat tactic that activates whenever an enemy performs a cavalry charge, the Takeda specialty. It's on his resume. By all accounts, he should have been able to hold out. It's what he's known for. And yet, with all of my combined combat experience, he trampled over me like nothing. The Murakami are destined to fall to the Takeda or the Uesugi. If there's some secret strategy, some way to repel them long enough to build up fortifications, or some means to strike to the heart and trigger authority, or some way to win an early siege against them, no matter what I did, I could not find it. Of course, maybe a better commander could handle the Murakami. Maybe someone with more game knowledge or mechanical ability could actually find the way, and maybe even without save states. The world is vast and full of incredible people with every imaginable skill. Maybe someone else was fit to shoulder the mantle of Murakami's ambition. Just not me. I think a lot about how I could have saved my career and avoided total humiliation, but I remember that no matter what I tried, nothing seemed to work right. It just didn't. I wasn't capable. I recently found out that a few of the students I taught from that LTO now have criminal charges, breaking and entering, trafficking drugs, etc., and that the student who gave me the hardest time even got charged with extortion and eventually assault. The victim was carted off to the hospital, beaten and slashed for telling a group of young adults to not cut through his neighbor's yard. And this isn't some sick, petty revenge thing. This is me looking back at a situation I felt I could not solve and realizing the weight of my failure. I couldn't even handle that class on the daily, and now our futures are impossibly different. I've been incredibly lucky, and that person, those people, are going to suffer. Maybe because I dared to stand there. Maybe because the system failed them. Parents, community, the school. Even if I can't change socioeconomic reality on my own, I wish I could. Maybe I could have bridged that gap somehow if I just did things better. When was that story decided exactly? I find it fascinating that the intended narrative journey of Nobunaga's ambition, a tiny clan conquering all of Japan, something intended from the Oda, who starts so small, feels so far from reach without significant privilege. The Chosokabe are tucked away in the sticks and one generation out from actual greatness. The Ashikaga have plenty, but they're destined for sudden ruin. You can pick them without realizing and find yourself crushed in minutes. The Murakami are genuinely doomed. Doomed by history, doomed by circumstances, doomed by mechanics. But this was something I already knew. Nobunaga's ambition isn't fair. He doesn't care if every clan is balanced just so. Life isn't fair. No person has their balance adjusted for this world. You're born, you live, and you die. The lesson I always needed to learn is that you can't strategize your life. Not really. I spent so much of my youth plotting and planning and crafting the conditions for success. After all, my brothers were as smarter than me, and headed for engineering and science. I didn't want to be the failure. While I went in for a bachelor's degree in English and creative writing out of raw interest, I needed to justify that education with something material, hence teaching. Or so I convinced myself after realizing writers don't get paid very well. I liked school. I liked English. I even liked Shakespeare and poetry. There was no money in those things without aiming for some kind of instructor's role. Of course, I wanted to make videos for the internet at the time. I saw the cultural moment, something interesting and new and completely removed from any of the old world I grew up around and lined my shelves with and did all my studying about. And everyone looked like they were having so much fun. But I was terrified to act, and so I languished, went through teacher's college for a safety net. I knew I didn't really want it. I did it because it was the right thing to do, a way to make a living, a way to excuse years of studying and minimal productivity. And if you're thinking, that sounds totally soulless, I agree. But I don't come from money. I live pretty close to cows. Most people around here don't push past grade 12. I was almost sure my life was written for me. I just had to make the right choices to end up okay. So I got every credential, padded my resume, always said yes. The entire Korea job wasn't about opening my eyes, but working for money, giving myself an edge when I went back to Canada and making enough to get married without sweating. It opened my eyes anyway, but regardless, every choice I made was for a greater purpose. I didn't spend that money. I didn't go on day trips or buy things. I made those choices, promised what I promised, and followed through. And almost every time, it let me down. You should run the numbers. You should take the wheel. But you have to acknowledge when it's time to change course. It's not wrong, it's real. And it's always gonna hurt. That's just how it goes. It's up to you to decide if the pain meant anything. Korean private school almost killed me. I sat in a lot of dark rooms between classes, disassociating. I stared down from the top floor of the high-rise where the playground was. I locked myself in that thankless, joyless job for a year. I know plenty of people who pulled through slightly less strenuous conditions, working in the Korean public school system alongside a co-teacher, fewer hours, not as stressed about money, spending their weekends on leisure tours. I complain about that job, but I threw myself to the wolves, into a job I barely wanted and in a situation that I was barely comfortable in. They sold it to me as mostly elementary, and it ended up as mostly kindergarten. And you don't get to take them to the labor board over that. Of course, even I was aware of how much less of a person I was becoming, and so, like always, I strategized. I planned YouTube scripts, I recorded footage, I wrote the first third of a novel. Every day, I went home from work and did something for the future me, just in case any of that actually panned out. And since I worked so hard, I figured it'd all work out when I got home. But Korea came and went. When I got back to Canada, I tried making videos, and all of them failed. Miserably, for 2 years even. They were really amateurish. I was amateurish at life. I spent so long in my own microcosm of entertainment, obsessing instead of doing, that I didn't even realize I was just making things mechanically, without any real interest in improving myself or pushing past the exact way I decided to succeed. It had happened like this, and I could not compromise. Eventually, after a few, "Are you gonna get a job again?" I worked for a daycare that had an opening. I still made videos, but I started pivoting towards teaching because I'd failed. In a year's time, I found myself waltzing into substitute teaching. How could I not? I had the resume. People knew my mother. It was a perfect fit. I've already told my high school stories. I don't mean to advocate against making smart choices. I think everybody has to, because nobody is coming to save any of us. If we fail, who actually will pick us up but ourselves? How long can you reasonably rely on help? All of us have to pull our own weight, or do our best to. But trying and pushing and forcing myself to be something I wasn't transformed me. Gone was the happy, naive idiot, and there in his place was the grimacing, miserable cynic. Not any smarter, hell of a lot shittier, drifting day to day without any real purpose, burning my free time into a sinking online career that didn't pay, and watching my life, my dreams, all the fluid colors of the world solidify and harden and fade. I don't regret my time teaching, neither in Korea or Canada. It taught me a lot, gave me a lot, without failing in all of these painful ways. I never would have found the spark to throw myself so completely into YouTube, my last stand. What I do regret is not acting sooner. If I bought a camera with the money I definitely had and tried learning something independently instead of only ever doing exactly as much as people asked and burning the rest of my time online, if I stopped prepping and started making faster, maybe I could have been a whole lot happier a whole lot sooner. But rotting was comfort, even when I was dissatisfied with my own existence. And so the people around me got to bear witness to years of painful unthreading. A man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. These words are carved into me. I've lived, or at least seized, a lot more for myself than I think I ever would have by waiting. And now that I look at it, I'm proud. I can't say I'm perpetually content, but I'm proud. Is it more worthwhile to live loudly or to pass your time in silence? I don't know. Maybe it was pure luck, or maybe all that work paid off for a reason. But regardless, I do know that I am the sum of my experiences, run off from a life of failure, pulling up and running over, and that you don't get to go back. You don't get a do-over. You are that puddle, ugly or not. You get one life, one hand. You play it as best you can. The most crushing image I came across of all the collected games was this girl. When you capture enemy officers by taking a castle in Nobunaga's Ambition, Rise to Power for PS2, the developers did something interesting by giving every officer a little blurb, a few short sentences to explain their historical weight and worth, memorialize their deeds. I guess these count as spoilers, except history is pretty darn settled, and I don't think that quite counts. But each officer becomes a person in that way, immortalized in this little PS2 game for whatever they did. Capturing forts, exceptional skill on the battlefield, unshakable loyalty. But most officers are men, the overwhelming majority. And while a few of the women definitely have blurbs, various female children of daimyos don't. And so while tabbing through the people I captured, reading their abridged biographies, I saw this girl with nothing. And there on the bottom screen, release, employ, execute. Like she wasn't even a person. Nothing but another resource. And it's true of that period's history that any given woman wasn't particularly privileged to seize their fate for themselves. What's worse is, I couldn't decide if this image was more or less tragic than any of the other officers. Hisahide Matsunaga is known today as one of Japan's 3 great villains. It's a reputation that followed him hundreds of years into the future, contorting representation of his face. Ko Shibusawa wanted to paint Nobunaga in a more flattering, or at least a more nuanced light, but even here, some characters' stories are written for them, even if it's just a consequence of known history. This girl, this child, had no words to emblazon her legacy, no eulogy. She was a void, someone for the outsider to pour context into, maybe aware that any attempt would amount to fiction. In the game's failure to humanize this person, she was also protected from any other person writing her story for her. And I don't know if that's a worse fate than being remembered. I think for a lot of us, passing like a dream would be a kindness. I've been working through these feelings for most of my time online. I taught concurrently with this gig while growing an online persona. I am, unfortunately, a person who's grown alongside my output. I'm in those places. I'm threaded into my work, my wins, and my complete losses. These things inform creation, travel through fingertips, and color the page. I could only talk about any of this, things I never told anyone but the very closest people to me initially, because I finally became something, even if it's only something, even if it's a work in progress, even if it too eventually fails. Dreams, ambitions can't really be inherited. Nobody can be compelled to be anything or granted a mantle earnestly. That fire wells up from within, a growing sense that something is missing, a piece of ourselves that isn't there. I don't presume to teach. I already failed in that pursuit. But if I could profess one thing, it's this. If you ever find yourself catching fire, if the world clashes with your colors and muffles your sounds, dampens your light, if you want even one good thing for yourself the world will not allow, take it with your own power. Rip it from the air itself. Seize fate's rigid threads and bend them to your will. Play for keeps. Never give an inch. No tradition is worth your peace. No expectation is worth your joy. Nothing inherited is truly yours. Only you can build the world you deserve. Only you can shoulder your own ambition. You can't sweat worrying about your legacy or who's writing it. You will not unite the world, and even if you did, you'd probably end up a demon king in the stories. A man's 50 years under heaven passes like a dream. But you can't count on heaven, so you've got to make it here. Now, to answer my less knowledgeable self, Nobunaga's ambition is about more than it seems. While the aesthetic languishes in only mild abstraction, it also rests comfortably in its frankness, in its inherent worth and weight. Dancing through a web of systemic minutiae, imperceptible limits and factors, warriors of a bygone era battle for a land that will forget them, that will have subsumed them long before their stories reach global ears, as long as anyone is left to remember. There they are. There we all are. Together. Welcome to the credit sequence. These are my $4 patrons. Let me blow your ears out.
Adam Welch,
Air Pirate Sid,
AK, Acropolis,
Alpha 42,
Ampersand,
Angel Rivera,
Angus, Anthony,
Aria,
Eric,
Ashley, my wife, my darling. I asked K-Bash to make you smile. Also, hi, Merrick.
Azrael,
Ashura,
Manicure,
Axin 8,
Bear Skeleton,
Basement Dweller,
Bosch 7,
Basil,
BK,
Do Crimes,
Bella, more like Smella,
Ben M,
Beguile,
Big Papa Spray,
Fight
of Cursed Sushi,
Blake Against the Machine,
Wargle Hargle, Blossom Dante, Boom Dead, PH Operator,
Borgur,
Born in Shadow, Brandon S,
Brendan Hesse,
British Gooch,
Cow,
Cajun Lady,
Cakesar,
Cedo, Casual Male XL,
Caesar T,
Chef Cow,
Hero Hero,
Court Fox,
Cordit,
Chris Bromo,
Cody Golden,
Comfy Moogle,
Commie Hog,
Couch Mo,
Cosmetic,
Crabmonger, Fish Finagler, Crashgers,
Crater,
Crispy J,
Mono 19D,
Cup of the Papa,
CW Glassworks,
Stag, Swaggy
David
Bet,
Castillo,
Dara,
Dash Granny,
Decode,
Deadwood,
Dead, The Strega. Did you know, if you put a wooden spoon on your pot while it's boiling, the pot spoon water will the still water pot. The boiling pot water steam spoon wood.
Dingus
Don't
Bat,
read this out loud. Oh no, he did
Doodle
it!
Flu,
Doug
Prince,
DJ, Professor K.
Dr.
House from the critically acclaimed television show House MD.
Dr. Cullen PhD,
Drop the Bass.
Duffman,
The Protagonist. Dylan Winston. El Jaguar. Electric Song. Elephant.
Althea,
Elsa.
Emperor Pickle,
Empty Tension.
Eric Monticello,
Excalibur Shine.
Exorian Hagen,
Gnar. Fail Knight. Americans just happy to be
Ferns
here.
Maximum,
Fusilian.
Forte Noir,
Frog Vorbis.
Frosty _Gamer _
Gandalf the Gay.
Garen Guaranteed,
Giggle Bite.
Glasses Kohai,
Glyph Seeker.
Nine Cat,
Dobo Bobo.
Gobsmack,
Goose 6112.
Gregor 700,
Great, the darkest black.
Garcory,
Gucci Plant.
Hatsune Miku's Crack House,
Archive.
Demon, Game and Station,
Helen Dingo.
Hermit J,
Hebe.
Honey Mutt,
Horn Tiger.
How do you know?
Huey.
just took 7 grams of magic mushrooms and now I'm lost in the woods.
I'm supporting K-Bash just because I wanted to make this part of the video longer. Inferno galore.
Ingenious Cloud,
IOBG.
I punched a sandwich.
It's not bad.
It's time to sue.
It's not good.
Ivy Ruth Langley,
Jack Hydrate.
Jacob,
Jalopy.
James,
Shane.
Jams.
Jank Dankins.
Jason Lasky.
Jaden.
James Vaughn.
Jara. Screaming Eyes.
Jay Drito.
JL Savarus.
Jay Deus.
JB.
JJ09.
JK Hedgehog.
John
Bo the Joker.
Jordan Joyner.
Jorzy Burden. Juicy Frost.
June.
Justice David Mania.
Gedoken.
Kellen. K-Chan.
Keegan Too Cool.
Keith the Thief. Key the Iron Idol.
Kata Snap.
King Kuma.
Key.
Knight Pike.
Kitty Cat.
Clock. K-Noe.
Kong 2020.
Rating.
Crazy Dark Chocolate.
Proper Time.
Ice.
Kyle. Not that Kyle. KZ Excellent.
Lady Weed.
Lesson.
Laundry Mom.
Lego Sid.
Lethal Nibbles.
Linkle.
Little Big Trouble.
Loathsome Dung Eater.
Lion Shark.
Y.
Low Res.
Low
Fat Moga.
Lucas Boyd.
Blood Mac James.
Lunati.
Magic Meow.
Malamatic Wolf.
Manapool.
Manic Pixie Space Pirate.
Man in Space.
Malfever.
Mara Ganger.
Hercules.
Marcus Rambles.
Massive.
Maxwell B.
Maximum Dog.
Meaty Smacks. Mechanized Memories.
Maple Puppet.
Mega Boy E Nasty.
Melly Tam.
Messiah of Rodents.
Metal Gear Gaseous.
Michelle Citrano.
Migsy.
Mike DeVere.
Renata.
Mithras.
Moa.
Bobby Dobby. Big Titty Gop. GF Cooley. Monochrome Rainbow.
Morgana Black.
Maury.
Morse.
Modi.
Mr. Pee Pee Poo Poo Kaka.
Mr. Yeety Dabface McYoink Bomb.
Myrna.
Naira New. Nito Torpedo.
Neon Dwarf.
Nick Krishna.
Nick LaRosa.
Nifty Rex.
Not Nobel.
Nuggy.
Okami.
OJ
McMuffins.
Old Burgle. Old Man Cranberry.
Ollie.
Omni Nerd Zero.
137.
Only LK.
Plant.
Oscar.
Paperland.
PBK.
Pandemic Cowboy.
Pelagic
Undulation.
PK Gaming.
E-Mike.
Popular Hitman. Prismatic Dan.
Pringle Prongle. Pringle Prongle. Probably not Grady.
Project Darklight.
Punch Fighter Champion.
Honosaurus Rex. Quasar McDougal. Quillworth.
Raging Anorexia.
Real Beans. Reggie Rodriguez.
Renteca Bond.
Ringed Relay.
Rowlett's Bowtie.
Rolando.
RP Gamer.
Ryan Michel.
Saigon Man.
Salsa. Salty Smasher. Scribe Slendy. Sakai no Award.
Sensual Coder.
Safarium.
7 Thumbs Up.
Sexy Bionicle GF.
Sergeant Shipwreck Shaw.
Nintendo.
Shut up, Wesley.
Silver Bear 909.
Sin.
God.
Sir Doodle's alive.
Seriously tired of waiting in line.
Sir Giggles XD.
Sir Speedster.
Skywardly.
Sleepy Wabbit.
Slippy Sloppy Bippy Boppy.
Snart. Small Turtle House.
Zeta Dad.
Sock'em Boppers.
Suckdolager.
Space Lizard.
Sports.
Spider Dad.
Squidgy.
Star Night Sky.
Streffin Battles. Super Dingus.
Super Sandwich Guy.
Taya Toxin.
George Chubbington. Terrence Swift.
The artist formerly known as Sam the Sam.
The Big Bubby. The Clown Prince of Cringe. The good Lord has blessed me. Hallelujah. The Green Loki.
The Crispy Boy.
The original Nars's Diet Thick Dew trademark Neo Edition.
The Peacemaker Pyro.
The Salt Knight.
The Nomad.
The Real McCoy.
The Toasted One.
Big Dick Mystic.
Fresh.
Rips Heart.
Tiggles McGuffin.
Tim Lobster. Timid the Writer.
Tony Jones. The Legend.
Total Play. Travis Edwards.
Tropical Avera.
Little Chungus.
Tie Guy 9001.
Unlawful Skies. Crippling Gotcha Addiction.
Vid.
Vacant Plaza. Valenrist.
Venom.
Vice Plot. Viewers Like You. Vic.
Volcendo.
Joaquin, get right in my bag.
Raposa.
Wayne is boss.
Weed Trash.
Waylon. Where am I? Help.
Whiskey Dodo.
Widgie. Winter Solstice.
Win TV.
Brencham. Zanny Tanner.
Sean D.
Stravius. Your boy Flyers.
Yero 12.
Yashichi.
Yay,
Kundo. Zachary Livesey.
Zachary D.
Zanasso.
Zane the Impure.
Zane the Pure. Zed Slayer Gamer.
Zephicamon Full Burner.
Zero Salazar.
Zenova.
Cyberpunk.
If you'd like to directly support the show and help me keep making interesting looks at the medium, check out my Patreon. New videos coming unless I'm dead.